Game of Thrones, The Wrath of the Sleeping Dragon. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 526 Escape. Ho, the black dragon roared, and its huge figure shuttled through the rain curtain, then swooped down at high speed, spewing out dragon flames. Boom, the surging dragon flames above poured down, destroying a large number of giant crossbows on the ground. The soldiers of Stormland screamed, and then died in the sea of fire. The corresponding giant dragon swooped down from the sky, and was also pierced with 2 crossbow arrows, but Balerion didn't care. This pain stimulated its bloodthirstiness even more, and the violent dragon flames continued to cleanse the earth. Rumble, the catapult was also submerged in the sea of fire, and the tall frame collapsed. Buckets of kerosene that were ready to be poured on the boulders were detonated, making a huge explosion, and the flames shot up into the sky and even a small mushroom cloud rose. More soldiers of Stormland were engulfed by the flames, and the moisture on their bodies was burned dry in an instant. They screamed miserably, and then lost their lives in terrible pain. Counterattack. Counterattack. However, the Stormland army still had a lot of giant crossbows prepared, and they were not all burned in Balerion's attack. Some of them were on the flat hillside, and some were hidden in the woods. They were scattered over a wide area, just to avoid being destroyed by the dragon's flame. Quick, get up. Facing a mythical creature like a dragon, the ambitious Stormland soldiers were stunned at first. However, they lay on the ground holding their heads, and waited until the figure of the dragon flew through the sky, saving their lives, and then they came to their senses again. Kill it. Kill this beast. The Stormland knights rode their horses, and looked up at the giant dragon flying away above their heads, and drew their swords angrily and roared. Bang, 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 followed by the sound of several giant crossbow bowstrings bursting, and the crossbow arrows broke through the air with a sharp whistle, rushing straight into the sky, but did not hit the distant target. When the dragon was in the sky, the target became smaller and the crossbow's crotches became larger, making it almost impossible to hit the target. Their only chance was to shoot it when Balerion dived down. But the dragon flew very fast when it was close to the ground, and a crossbow required the cooperation of several soldiers at the same time. 2 soldiers were responsible for shaking the pull shaft to adjust the shooting angle and aiming. Several soldiers were responsible for pulling the bowstring, and 1 soldier pressed the crossbow arrows comparable to spears into the grooves similar to rifling, and finally worked together to shoot the crossbow arrows out. Therefore, using a large number of crossbows to deal with the dragon requires not only excellent skills, but also luck. Balerion's roar spread throughout the sky. It flew in the air and spit out dragon flames to clean the crossbow arrows inserted into its body, burning them to ashes, and then dived down again. The battle entered a white-hot stage. There was a strong pressure from Balerion in the sky, and the resistance of the Storm army on the ground became more and more difficult, and even the front line began to waver and became precarious. Stannis Baratheon, who was a Duke of Storm's End and Lord of Stormland, could not sit still when he saw this scene. Let the cavalry go. Yes, my lord. Then he finally played another card and sent the cavalry of Stormland to attack proactively, entangle the Targaryen cavalry, and protect the center of the battle line from the flank. Boom boom, the cavalry behind the Stormland battle line began to move out. They were wearing armor of various families, with colorful emblems and decorations printed on their chests. The sound of horses' hooves rumbled, and the heavy hooves stepped on the muddy ground, and then splashed mud. Kill. Kill all these bastards. Drive them out of our home. The cavalry of Stormland had been ready for a long time, and finally waited for the opportunity to attack. In fact, these cavalry knights were the real main force of the Stormland army. They were all composed of nobles and their family soldiers. They had undergone rigorous training, and were naturally not at the same level as the temporarily captured strongmen. Then, accompanied by the rumbling sound of iron hooves, the overwhelming Stormland cavalry poured into the battlefield, and the situation on the battlefield changed again. Kill. Clang clang. The cavalry fought and swung their swords, their armors rubbed against each other, and from time to time a knight was stabbed by a spear, screaming and falling off the horse. Bang! Some war horses suddenly collided with each other, and the war horses neighed in pain. The knights on horseback fell to the ground, then pulled out their daggers and crawled on the muddy ground, white knives in and red knives out. And finally one of the golden core war elephants fell down. This adult male grey elephant was wearing golden armor, but it was pierced with spears and was bathed in blood. Behind it were the bodies of Stormland soldiers everywhere, plowing out a bloody channel, causing heavy losses to the Stormland army. Devil. Many soldiers looked at this huge beast, watching it trample their companions into a pulp, and couldn't help but break down emotionally, throwing down their weapons and running away. However, this adult male grey elephant finally couldn't hold on at this time. It finally let out a loud whine, and its two front legs as thick as stone pillars softened, and then collapsed, and hit the ground heavily. Devil. This monster is dead. This monster is dead. Seeing the war elephant collapse, the soldiers of Stormland couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief, and then cheered. However, the fall of a war elephant was not enough to change the situation of the entire war. This vigorous battle of Bronze Gate City lasted from early morning to dusk. The sun set. The blood of the soldiers on both sides dyed the land red, and the sound of drums and horns continued for a long time. Although Stannis was a battle-hardened commander, he was now at his wit's end. He used all his means, but could not change the outcome of this war. In the end, the Stormland army could not withstand the attack of the Targaryen army. Dragons were flying in the sky, and war elephants were roaring on the ground. The battle line began to collapse from one point, and then quickly spread to the entire army in an irreversible trend. Run. Run. The Stormland army began to collapse. Even if Stannis personally went to the battlefield to supervise the battle, and led the supervision team to kill the deserters, he could not stop the soldiers from escaping. Some members of the supervision team were even killed by the deserters. The two sides immediately drew their swords, and the supervision team and the deserters fought together. The situation was completely out of control. Lord Stannis. The war is over. Retreat to Storm's End. The Onion Knight rushed to Stannis' side and said anxiously, "I will not abandon my soldiers." Stannis' face was covered with blood. He had just killed several deserters, but he could not stop the collapse of the battle. "You are the commander of the entire army, not some fucking infantryman." Davos was so anxious that he couldn't help but swear. Then he winked at the guards beside Stannis. The guards immediately understood what he meant. They carried Stannis and put him on the warhorse. Stannis symbolically resisted and scolded a few times, but was then carried to the warhorse by the guards. He rode on the horse, turned his head, and took a last look at the stormtroopers, who were being slaughtered one-sidedly, with an unwilling look on his face, and finally squeezed his legs against the horse's belly. "Let's go." Then he fled the battlefield surrounded by the guards. Chapter 527, Escape back to Storm's End. King Viserys personally led the Golden Corps to fight a decisive battle with the rebel leader Stannis and his Stormland army at Bronzegate. The battle lasted from early morning to dusk. The Stormland army once stubbornly resisted the attack of the Targaryen army and even briefly gained the upper hand, creating a lot of trouble for the Targaryen army. But after the Golden Corps famous war elephants and dragons joined the battle, the scene of the war changed. The Stormland army was unable to fight against the overlords of the sky and the earth. In fact, their performance has been extraordinary. They stubbornly protected their homes. Stannis' command ability was also very good, but they were powerless to save the situation. The blood of the soldiers dyed the earth red. In the end, the Stormland army was defeated in the Battle of Bronzegate, leaving corpses and supplies all over the ground, and fleeing in a hurry. At the same time, they lost many villages, towns, and castles in the Stormland along the way. The Targaryen army was unstoppable with the power of victory. Bronzegate, Hay Hall, Harvest Hall and Fellwood fell one after another. Stannis felt a long-lost sense of powerlessness when facing Viserys. The last time he felt this way was when he first faced the White Walkers at the Wall. At that time, facing these endless and inexhaustible dead armies, Stannis felt deeply powerless. All his lifelong learning and rich experience on the battlefield were of no use. And now Stannis felt the same way when facing Viserys. If it was just the dragons, he would have thought that Viserys also had war elephants under his command, which the Westeros soldiers had never seen before. When these monsters from another continent first appeared on the battlefield, they put great psychological pressure on all the horses and soldiers. I don't know how many soldiers were scared, and the horses were frightened and ran away. And in this battle, only one of Viserys' dragons was involved. He also had a dragon ridden by Rhaegar's daughter to torture Tywin in the west, another dragon guarding Pentos, and 5 little babies who had not grown up. It was with a steep sense of powerlessness and unwillingness that Stannis fled back to his old nest, Storm's End, under the protection of his personal guards. Open the city. Open the city. In the dark night. Trample trample, a dozen war horses galloped over, carrying knights in tattered armor and dusty faces, coming from far to near to the gate of Storm's End. They still held the scorched crown and stag flag in their hands and shouted loudly. The top of Storm's End was brightly lit, and soldiers from the Baratheon family were guarding it. The bad news of the Battle of Bronzegate City a few days ago had already come, and Storm's End was immersed in a mood of despair. Everyone was in a state of panic, not knowing when it would be their turn. Stop. Who is it? However, the soldiers on the top of Storm's End still forced themselves to be alert when they heard the shouting from below, shining torches downwards, and then saw a familiar face. The cavalry is back. The cavalry is back. Woo! Then a low horn sounded from the top of Storm's End, and then the heavy gates opened wide to welcome the cavalry outside the castle back. Here, slow down. Whoa, the sound of horse hooves was noisy and chaotic, and the remnants of the Stormland returned to Storm's End. Help me get off the horse. Then Stannis, who was also a little dusty, turned over and got off the horse with the help of the guards. His legs were rubbed with blisters, and he couldn't even get off the horse by himself. It hurt when he touched it, but Stannis' face did not change. He just took a breath of cool air, took off his gloves, and threw them on the ground. This time the escape was a bit difficult. During the period, Stannis was almost discovered by the giant dragon flying in the sky several times. There was even a dragon flame that drowned in front of him, and 2 guards who were not able to react in time were burned to ashes, but he jumped off the horse one step ahead and got into the grass. It can be said that he escaped from death. Fortunately, the terrain conditions in the Stormlands are relatively complex. Although there are not as many mountains as in the Westerlands and the Vale, there are still mountains and dense forests. Especially the forests, because of the long-term rain. The forests here are very lush. Stannis hid in the east and west under the protection of his personal guards, and finally saved his life, and escaped back to Storm's End. The horn sounded on the top of the city. Although it was late at night, the city of Storm's End was still bustling. The old Maester Cresson, whose hair was grey and even trembled when he walked, hurried over with a cane. Stannis. Since Stannis and Renly killed each other, Maester Cresson looked much more haggard. In the past, although the old man was old, he was full of energy, but now he needs to use a cane. Stannis, I've heard about the battlefield. It's okay, it's no big deal. Life is a long journey. You're still young, and it's inevitable that you'll make mistakes. Failure once or twice is nothing. Storm's End has ancient magical protection. It has never been breached by the outside world since ancient times. Although the dragon is terrible, the dragon flame cannot be shaken. The grey-haired old Maester spoke tremblingly. When the bad news of the Battle of Bronzegate came, Maester Cresson felt like a thunderbolt. But he was not afraid of death. He had served the Baratheon family for a lifetime, followed Duke Stephen Baratheon, and watched these children grow up. For the first time, he truly felt that the Baratheon family was in danger of destruction, and it was very likely in this crisis. Moreover, the Baratheon family could not surrender. Begging Viserys to forgive the Baratheon family? This is no different from suicide. However, Maester Cresson did not express his inner sense of crisis. Instead, like a father, he comforted his children that failure once or twice was no big deal. Maester Cresson's words touched Stannis' inner weakness. The man with a resolute face was silent for a moment, but he did not show his inner weakness. He just nodded and said in a low voice, "I was lucky to escape." Then he felt a pain on the inside of his thigh, raised his head and looked around, and saw many anxious faces. Except for Maester Cresson, everyone in Storm's End was in a state of panic, as if the world crisis was just around the corner. Stannis' heart sank slightly. He was silent for a moment, and then spoke. "It's getting late. I just returned from a long journey. Mr. Let's talk about it tomorrow. Mr. Crescent nodded quickly, and then Stannis returned to his bedroom in Storm's End. Chapter 528, Death of Stannis. The bright moon was hanging high tonight, and the cold moonlight sprinkled on the windowsill. The night was quiet, and only the remaining water drops on the eaves made sounds from time to time. The defeated soldiers on the front line returned, causing a brief commotion in Storm's End, and then everything returned to peace. After all, it was late at night, and people went to sleep again, but the lights were still on in the bedroom of Stannis, the owner of Storm's End. Stannis certainly couldn't sleep, and the defeated Bronze Gate became his nightmare. He once thought that the White Walkers were his nightmare, and it was almost impossible for humans to defeat the White Walkers, and then the rage of the Battle of Reverin left him with a great psychological shadow. Then Stannis was shot in the knee with an arrow, spent several months in prison, and escaped successfully. He thought he had walked out of the original nightmare, but he didn't expect to fall into a new nightmare again. In this battle, he killed more than 30,000 men in the Stormlands, fathers, sons, and brothers of more than 30,000 families. And if the old, weak, and disabled who were responsible for logistics were counted, this number would be even more exaggerated. He made sufficient preparations for this battle, but he did not expect that the result of this battle would destroy the future and hope of the entire Stormlands. The Baratheon family has ruled this land for nearly 300 years, and how many people hate him now? The candlelight in the bedroom of the Master of Storm's End flickered gently. Stannis sat quietly at the desk, and he had not even taken off his armor. His face was still the same as before, calm and resolute, like a stone in the pit, smelly and hard. But his breathing was a little heavy. Stannis was thinking about a series of recent events, including the death of Renly, the defeat of Bronze Gate City, etc. However, at this moment, someone knocked on his bedroom door. Bang bang Davos. Come in. Stannis, who was sitting at the table, woke up slightly. He subconsciously thought it was the Onion Knight, because he was his most trusted aide, and had just escaped from the battlefield. But Stannis frowned the next second, after he blurted out this sentence. He realized that the person coming could not be Davos, because Davos had been by his side for so long that Stannis was already familiar with his habits, including speaking and doing things. When Davos knocked on the door, he would definitely say "My lord" instead of just pushing the door open or keeping silent. William? I don't know if it was because of his excellent sixth sense or his suspicious personality, but Stannis suddenly felt a sense of alarm in his heart at this time. He subconsciously grasped the hilt of the sword at his waist. He had not yet taken off the dusty armor on his body, and naturally did not take off his sword, and then called his guards. Stannis was once the Duke of Dragonstone, and now he is the Master of Storm's End. He is of noble birth and high status. There are always loyal guards standing in front of his bedroom door, and this young man named William is one of Stannis' guards. His family has served the Baratheon family for 3 generations. His father once accompanied Stannis' father, Duke Stephen, to Volantis. Later, when they returned to Shipbreaker Bay, they encountered a storm and the ship sank. Therefore, William is truly red-blooded, and Stannis trusts him very much. However, now Stannis suddenly felt a sense of alarm in his heart. He grasped the hilt of the sword and called the guard's name, but he didn't get any response. He completely realized that something was wrong. Bang! At this time, the door of Stannis' bedroom was knocked open by a young man with a broad chest, a strong body, and strong arm muscles. He was wearing the armor of a Baratheon soldier, and holding a long sword with a trace of blood on the blade. William, a guard who had been loyal to the Baratheon family for 3 generations, and was devoted to Stannis, fell in a pool of blood. It seemed that he was killed by the man who was skilled in fighting and attacked suddenly, causing William to fall down before he could react. He originally wanted to trick Stannis into opening the door himself, so that the noise would be less, and he could get away with killing him, but he didn't expect Stannis to be fooled. So the man had to break open the door and rush in, killing Stannis to avenge his brother. There's an assassin. Stannis in the house saw this scene and shouted decisively, calling for the guards in the castle to rescue him. At the same time, he drew the long sword at his waist, his cheeks tense, and his eyes staring at the other party. Who are you? He looked familiar, but then he remembered that the other person looked a bit like Renly's staff, Donald Swan of Stonerhelm, but the other person was more sturdy, far more than Donald. Are you Balance Swan? Stannis suddenly remembered that Earl Gullion Swan of Stonerhelm had another son, who was said to be strong, skilled in martial arts, and brave and good at fighting. However, the other person did not answer, but roared and rushed over, holding a long sword and slashing. Seeing this, Stannis hurriedly raised his sword to resist. Clang, then the two long swords collided heavily, with a harsh metal collision sound, and even sparks burst out. Damn it. Stannis only felt that his palms were a little hot, and his ears were buzzing. Balance Swan's power was too great, and Stannis was no match for him. And in Storm's End, there was also movement outside the bedroom where Stannis lived. What happened? What's going on? It seems that Stannis' cry for help just now worked, and some guards have heard the sound and rushed over. Then they saw the body lying outside Stannis' bedroom door, and immediately realized that something was wrong. It's bad. Lord Stannis was assassinated. Quick, quick, quick. Someone come. There was a noise outside Stannis' bedroom door. In his bedroom, in the narrow space, Stannis was still fighting with Baron Swan. He was no match for this strong young man, and the other party's martial arts were more exquisite. The long sword in Stannis' hand was even knocked away, and the knuckles burst and oozed out blood. Caca. Baron Swan held the long sword and chopped it on the desk in the bedroom, directly splitting the heavy desk in half, and Stannis rolled over in a panic to avoid Baron Swan's sword. Bang, then his head hit the bookcase beside him, and he suddenly felt a little dizzy. But Stannis gasped heavily, not daring to delay at all, and pulled out the dagger from his waist. This dagger was the one that killed his own brother Renly, because he knew that this was the most dangerous moment in his life. In the past, the enemies on the battlefield would try to capture him alive, but the assassin did not listen to any of his explanations and just wanted to take his life immediately. Lord Stannis. Bang. At this time, the guards of Storm's End finally arrived, and they rushed into Stannis' bedroom. However, they only saw the final scene. Balance Swan grabbed Stannis' shoulder with a long sword, pierced his chest with a sword, and then pulled out the sword, and blood spurted out. Cough for the first time, Stannis' resolute and indifferent face, which never smiled, showed a violent emotional fluctuation. He gasped and looked at Balance Swan, as if he wanted to say something, but couldn't say it. Blood blocked his trachea, and came out of his mouth. Then the dagger that had killed Renly clanked to the ground, and the body fell to the ground. Chapter 529 Baron Shiwen. Stannis is dead. He died at the hands of Balance Swan, the second son of Stonerhelm. The other party was avenging his brother, Donald Swan, who was once Renly's staff member, but was shot to death by arrows in Stannis' coup to seize Storm's End. Therefore, it is reasonable and morally tenable for Balance Swan to avenge Stannis. Although Stannis has been claiming to the outside world that Renly and Viserys conspired to kill him and surrender Storm's End, after he captured Storm's End, he knew in advance that the news was leaked. So he took the initiative, and it was Renly who committed the crime of parricide first. However, after capturing Storm's End, Stannis did not find any evidence in Renly's bedroom that Renly and Viserys were planning to plot to kill him. There was not even any correspondence between the two, only a blank piece of paper was found on the table. After learning about this, Stannis locked himself in the room for 3 days, and then ordered the news to be blocked. However, there is no impenetrable wall in the world, not to mention that there are still many guards and servants in Storm's End who were once loyal to Renly and even miss him now. Compared with Stannis, who had a stern face all day long, as if everyone owed him 500 silver deer, Renly, who was gentle, considerate and had no heirs, was naturally more supported by his subordinates. Therefore, the news was eventually leaked. Although no one dared to mention it in front of Stannis, it was inevitable that there were discussions in private. Stannis fell in a pool of blood, and the guards of Storm's End surrounded the murderer and then rushed forward. Catch him! Catch him! Although Balance Swan, the second son of Stonerhelm, was brave and good at fighting, he was no match for Four Hands after he killed Stannis. In the end, he was besieged by the guards of Storm's End, captured alive, and tied up. Stannis' assassination in his bedroom was naturally earth-shattering news, especially for Storm's End, who had trouble sleeping tonight. Mr. Crescent burst into tears when he heard the news. Although he had predicted this day, since he received the bad news of the Battle of Bronze Gate, he still couldn't accept that the Baratheon family was heading towards extinction step by step. He watched the 3 boys he grew up with die one after another. Now only Robert was imprisoned in King's Landing, but his death was only a matter of time. The Onion Knight, Stannis' most trusted aide, was shocked when he heard the news, and then hurried over. Balance 1 was tied up and pressed in the center of the hall. The nobles, coaches, and maesters in Storm's End gathered together. This is murder. Balance 1 killed Lord Stannis. He deserves to be put to death. Davos hurried to the scene and looked at the murderer who was pressed in the center of the Hall of Storm's End and spoke angrily. The Onion Knight was now filled with remorse. In fact, he had seen Balance 1 before the Battle of Bronze Gate. However, as the least experienced noble in Stormlands, the Seaworth family had no background and no connection with other nobles. Therefore, he only felt that the other party looked familiar, but did not recognize Balance 1. If he could have discovered earlier that the other party had lurked in the army and had ill intentions, but now Davos's remorse was useless. Stannis had died in the hands of the other party. His body had been cleaned and his remains were arranged. Cat's eyes were covered with cat's eyes. He was wearing a gorgeous armor with a crown and a stag emblem, his hands crossed on his lower abdomen, and he lay quietly on the long dining table in the center of the Hall of Storm's End. As the murderer, Balance 1 was pressed down and knelt beside Stannis' body. Now there are still several nobles from Stormland in Storm's End. The Earl of Longarch, Alexander Steeman, nicknamed Gold Worship Earl, sits in the center, with a dagger through his heart on his chest. Beside him are Countess Mary Mettelin of Mistwood, with a white long-horned owl on her chest, and Count Costa Morrigan of Crow's Nest, with a flying raven on his chest. When several nobles from Stormland heard Davos' angry words, they looked at each other, and then their eyes fell back on him. Ahem. Countess Alexander Steeman of Longarch, who was sitting at the head of the group, coughed lightly and then spoke. Lord Davos, don't be impulsive. Please sit down. Although Countess Mary Mettelin of Mistwood, who was next to him, did not speak, a look of disdain flashed across her eyes. HMPH, they were already giving the Onion Knight enough face by calling him Lord. Davos was just a lucky smuggler, who happened to be appreciated by Stannis, and soared to the sky. He turned from a smuggler into the lord of a territory on Cape Wrath. However, as the youngest noble of Stormland, the Seaworth family only had a territory but no castle. Now that Stannis was dead, Davos's biggest backer had fallen. Naturally, these traditional nobles looked down on Davos, who was a smuggler. When the Onion Knight heard the words of the Earl of Longarch, he took a deep breath and calmed his anger. He glanced at the body of Stannis lying quietly in the middle of the hall, with sadness in his eyes, and then sat on a chair beside him. In any case, as a member of the Stormland nobles, Davos was still qualified to have a chair in this hall. Everyone came together, and there was silence in the Hall of Storm's End. Then the Earl of Longarch coughed lightly and spoke first. Sir Balance 1. Lord Davos has accused you of murdering Lord Stannis. The evidence is irrefutable, and you should be sentenced to death. Are you willing to plead guilty? Alexander Steeman made a gesture to Balance 1, who was kneeling on the ground with his shoulders pressed down. Although Balance 1 had well-developed muscles, he was not stupid either. He immediately understood what he meant, and struggled to stand up. At the same time, he shook his head and denied loudly, but was pressed down again by the soldiers of Storm's End. I plead not guilty. Oh. Balance 1, you don't admit that you killed Lord Stannis? Lord Costa Morrigan of Crow's Nest, who was sitting on another chair, narrowed his eyes and spoke. No, I admit that I killed Stannis. But I do not accept the charge of murder. Stannis killed Lord Renly, and also killed my brother. God has given us the power to judge, avenge, and uphold justice. I'm seeking justice for Lord Renly and avenge my brother's death. I'm judging Stannis. Balance 1 was very strong. Although his hands were tied, the two soldiers could not hold down his shoulders, and forced him to stand up again. He spoke loudly in the Hall of Storm's End. Chapter 530, Trial by Combat. As soon as Balance 1 finished speaking, there was an uproar in the Hall of Storm's End. A murderer dared to be so arrogant in Storm's End. Damn barbarian. Fuck him. I'll kill him. I'll pull out his tongue. Although Stannis was not very popular because of his personality and the title of Kinslayer, he still had many supporters, especially the soldiers and sergeants at the bottom. After all, this is Storm's End, a castle that the Baratheon family has run for nearly 300 years. I don't know how many servants here have served the Baratheon family for generations. They were furious when they heard Balance One's words, and they all expressed their desire to have close contact with his mother and butt. Moreover, Balance One was a borderland native. The Swan family of Stonerhelm was a powerful lord in the borderland. Therefore, when facing Stannis' call, they could do nothing, and Stannis had no way to deal with them. However, due to the complex geographical discrimination between the Stormlands and the Reach, the people living in the Reach, which is the most developed and wealthy, look down on those living in the borderlands and the Stormlands, while the people in the Stormlands look down on those living in the borderlands, even though they live on the same land. Therefore, they call Balance One a barbarian, and the burly borderland man glares at him, not afraid at all. Come on. Let go of my hands. I'll let you pull out my tongue. The soldiers of Storm's End who are loyal to Stannis and Balance One passionately swear at each other, and the several Stormland nobles sitting on the central throne look at each other again. Okay. Then it was still Earl Alexander Steeman of Long Arch, who once again acted as a good man to smooth things over, stopped the swearing below, and then spoke. Don't be impulsive. The most urgent thing is to solve the problem at hand. Lord Stannis is dead. What should we do next? On the other side, Countess Mary Metling of Mistwood City also sneered and spoke. You should know that there are tens of thousands of Targaryen troops heading for Storm's End 100 miles away. Someone plays a good cop and someone plays the bad cop. With coaxing and intimidation, the whole place fell silent. As soon as Countess Mary Metling finished speaking, everyone shut up, and the atmosphere became a little depressing. Stannis was the backbone of everyone, but he died. But their enemies were still heading for Storm's End. What should they do? I heard what Sir Balance One just said. There is some truth in that. Seeing that Countess Mary Metling's words silenced everyone present, the Countess of Landark, who played the good cop, looked around at everyone with satisfaction, then stood up and spoke again. No matter what, Lord Stannis did kill Renly, and committed the crime of parricide. And Stannis also killed Sir Balance One's brother. It is reasonable for Sir Balon to seek revenge on Stannis. Revenge for relatives is the sacred right given to us by the just father. Alexander Steeman held the table with his hands, stood up from his chair and said, this time, everyone in the Hall of Storm's End looked at each other. There was no noisy sound, and no one spoke out against it. In fact, in the final analysis, the Swan family of Stonerhelm was powerful. They had a long history and powerful forces. They were the lords who dominated the frontier, arrogant and rigorous. Renly did not recruit Earl Gullion Swan of Stonerhelm to Storm's End during his lifetime. He only sent out a son. Stannis killed his son, and could not make Earl Stonerhelm send troops to help. The three dishes in front of him, tied together, were not as powerful as Stonerhelm, so they naturally did not dare to execute Gullion Swan's only son in Storm's End. Moreover, Stannis is dead now, and the Baratheon family is doomed. Naturally, there is no need to offend the Swan family in order to avenge Stannis. These families with a long history naturally have a clear plan in their hearts. This is also the rule of the game that they have relied on for survival for so many years. However, at this time, the taciturn Earl Morrigan of Crow's Nest spoke. Although the father has given us these sacred powers, Sir Balance One killed Lord Stannis after all. He should be tried by combat, and let the gods decide whether he can see the sun tomorrow, or. Earl Morrigan shrugged his shoulders. His attitude was evident in his words. However, Balance One below took a deep breath and let go of most of his heart. Combat? He was never afraid, and then nodded. I admit that I killed Stannis. I'm willing to accept the trial by combat and let the gods decide whether I should live. The Hall of Storm's End was silent, and the performance of the three actors and the murderer continued. A murderer who was straight-tempered and avenged his brother, and three nobles who did not want to offend the Swan family. The Onion Knight Davos Seaworth, who was sitting next to the three Stormland nobles, was silent throughout the whole process, without saying a word. His face was serious, and his eyes kept scanning everyone's face. Although Davos was not good at marching and fighting, His old profession was smuggling. He was eloquent and best at reading people's hearts. The atmosphere in the Hall of Storm's End was weird now. Everyone changed after Stannis' death. Whether it was the soldiers who were just indignant and wanted to fight Balance Swan, or the 3 Stormland nobles who each had a different face, everyone's face had some panic that could not be concealed. Except for Mr. Cresson. Davos couldn't bear to look at the expression on the old Meester's face. He was dull and lifeless, and even allowed the 3 Stormland nobles to gossip and make trouble in Storm's End, in their master's house, and in front of Lord Stannis' body. Sir Davos, are you willing to fight for Lord Stannis? At this time, Lord Costa Morrigan suddenly turned his head and looked at the Onion Knight and asked. Davos's breathing stagnated slightly, and then he turned his head and stared at Lord Costa Morrigan. His eyes seemed to be able to kill, and then Davos finally resisted the urge to draw his sword on the spot, stretched out his broken palm, and spoke seriously. I really want to fight for Lord Stannis, but I know I'm not good at fighting, and cannot give the prisoner a fair trial. As Davos' voice fell, a few subtle laughs suddenly rang out from somewhere in the Hall of Storm's End, and Lord Crow's Nest could not help but smile. At this time, a loud roar of a dragon suddenly came from the sky above Storm's End. Chapter 531, Surrender of Storm's End. Viserys rode a black dragon, and landed alone in Storm's End. The trial in the Hall of Storm's End was naturally interrupted. Everyone walked out of the hall, and looked up at the sky. When the huge black dragon landed, the silver-haired young man riding the dragon jumped off the dragon's back. The nobles and guards of the Stormland below were all a little timid, and didn't even dare to step forward. Is he Viserys? Not many people have seen Viserys in Storm's End now, but his iconic silver gold hair, lavender eyes, handsome face, and riding a huge black dragon are enough to prove his identity. It is estimated that there is no other person in the world who can forge his identity. However, they still can't believe their eyes. Viserys is the enemy leader who they have been wanting to eat his flesh and drink his blood. How can he have the courage to land alone in Storm's End? How can he have this courage? How dare he do that? The nobles of Stormland looked at each other and saw the shock and fear in each other's eyes. Viserys came too suddenly, and the timing of his arrival was too perfect. It seemed that he had calculated that Stannis would die at this time. Storm's End was leaderless at the moment, and no one could stand up and control the overall situation. And his courage was too great. The nobles of Stormland still couldn't figure out how he dared to do that. However, the more fearless Viserys was, the more cautious the nobles of Stormland became. What's more, the huge dragon was lying there, with its head raised high, and a pair of skull eyes overlooking the little ones on the ground. Perhaps if they made any unusual movements, they would be burned to ashes in an instant by the dragon's flame. Now all the leaders of Storm's End gathered outside the hall, and the dragon's flame would really wipe them out. The nobles of Storm's End were terrified, and were frightened by Viserys' courage to come alone. They looked at each other. Lord Morrigan of Crow's Nest slightly gripped the hilt of his sword, and glanced at Lord Alexander Steeman of Landark. The other side shook his head at him implicitly, signaling him not to act rashly. On the other side, Countess Mary Mettling of Mistwood also looked pale. Then their eyes fell on the Onion Knight Davos. This, Lord Davos. It was not until this time that they remembered Davos' excellent communication skills. He was Stannis' most trusted staff, so the Stormland nobles wanted to push Davos to the front at this time. And the Onion Knight was also the only one among the people present who had seen Viserys in person. He had followed Stannis on the Far Expedition and participated in the combat meeting of the human coalition of the twins. At that time, he had seen the young Dragon Lord in person. However, they saw Davos' ugly face at this moment, even uglier than when he was humiliated by Lord Crow's Nest, because the person in front of them was indeed the real Viserys. Afterwards, Davos did not care about the past grudges. When the nobles of the Stormlands were cowering and retreating behind, he stood up alone and took the lead. He took a deep breath, mustered his courage, walked forward and bowed slightly, then spoke. Your Majesty, I wonder what brings you to Storm's End so late at night. His words directly confirmed the true identity of the calm-looking silver-haired young man in front of him. He was the new king who had just been crowned in King's Landing. I heard that Stannis is dead. and Viserys had been looking at the environment inside Storm's End since he jumped off the dragon's back. This place is worthy of being the strongest fortress in the Seven Kingdoms. Viserys had been to Storm's End when he was a child. At that time, in order to prevent the last fleet loyal to the Targaryen family from being buried in the storm, he tried his best to encourage the fleet to leave Dragonstone. Finally, the fleet commander listened to the little prince's advice and sent a fleet to raid Storm's End, which caused the Baratheon royal fleet, which had spent a lot of money, to fail in the womb and sink in the harbor, thus avoiding the largest storm surge in the narrow sea. However, Viserys was on the deck at that time. Looking at Storm's End from the outside, it was like a fist rising into the sky, standing firm in the storm. But now Viserys was airdropped directly into the interior of Storm's End. All his enemies were terrified when they saw him alone, and they didn't even dare to look him in the eye. Such an extreme gap only took about 10 years. A huge dynasty went from prosperity to decline and then collapsed, and a new great dynasty gradually stood up, just like Storm's End standing in the storm, regardless of wind and rain. Viserys had clearly felt a sense of oppression since he rode a dragon into the sky above Storm's End, and Balerion had the same obvious feeling. It seems that the rumor that Storm's End has magical protection is not groundless. It has never been breached from the outside for thousands of years. However, no matter how strong a fortress is, it will eventually collapse from the inside, just like the death of Stannis. Viserys' light words made Davos's breathing suddenly tighten. He glanced at Balance One, then suppressed his emotions and asked calmly, "Is Balance One the assassin sent by His Majesty?" Since Viserys knew that Stannis would die tonight, wouldn't Balance One, the murderer, be related to Viserys? However, Balance One, who was still tied up, looked confused when he heard his words. He was upright and wanted to avenge his brother. He was really not sent by Viserys to assassinate Stannis. No, Balance One was not the assassin I sent. Do you think I still need to use this trick to deal with Stannis now? The silver-haired young man looked around the scenery in Storm's End and then spoke calmly. If I wanted to kill him this way, he would have died long ago. He saw the faces of the people coming out of the hall of Storm's End not far away, with different expressions of fear, and then his eyes fell on the Onion Knight again. He didn't expect that such a big Storm's End would require the Onion Knight, a smuggler who even had a handicap, to stand up. I saw it with my own eyes. Then Viserys pointed to his own eyes and spoke seriously, then patted him on the shoulder, and walked alone to the hall of Storm's End. He wanted to see Stannis, and none of the nobles and soldiers of the Stormlands dared to stop him, and they hurriedly made way, leaving the Onion Knight standing there blankly. Chapter 532 Star Shuttle City. Viserys surrendered to Storm's End alone. When the nobles of Stormland saw the king who had opened up a new country, they buried their heads in the ground like ostriches, not daring to say a word. Viserys sat in the hall of Storm's End, and Stannis' body was displayed in the center of the hall. The nobles of Stormland hid in the corner of the hall in disgrace. Later, Viserys remembered them and called their names, and then they came out trembling. There were too many stories that happened that night, enough to be recorded in history and become part of the historical wave for future generations to comment on. Now, in addition to laughing at the 3 Stormland nobles who served as background boards, people are more in awe of the young king. One person surrendered a city, which is enough to become a great legendary story. People also realized at this time that Viserys' process of unifying the 7 kingdoms seemed to be unstoppable. A few days after Viserys surrendered to Storm's End alone, the Targaryen army finally arrived and officially unified the land and incorporated Stormland into the territory of the kingdom. On the other side, Viserys' court relatives, Queen Irion's family, the Dornish army suffered a defeat in Highgarden and retreated hundreds of miles to Starspit in one breath. Starspit is the only way from the Dornish march to Highgarden. After winning the Battle of the Marches and occupying Nightsong, the Dornish army went straight to Highgarden and surrounded this beautiful garden castle. Starspit, which was on the way of the Dornish army, naturally could not escape. However, Earl Titus' peak of Starspit was very straightforward. When the Dornish army arrived, he knelt and surrendered directly. Anyway, it was impossible to stop it. The goal of the Dornish army was Highgarden, and he was just an inconspicuous stumbling block on the road of the Dornish army. Moreover, Earl Titus Peak also had some distant relatives on the Iron Throne side. Leswell Peak was an exiled lord of the Golden Company and also a commander of the Golden Company. But he did not follow Viserys to the Stormlands. Instead, after the Golden Company recaptured King's Landing, he took a new mission and left here soon after, sailing straight to Dorne. Leswell Peak accepted the order of Princess Rhaenys, who was sitting on the Iron Throne at the time, and served as the representative of the Targaryen army in Dorne, responsible for the communication and cooperation between the two sides. Leswell Peak gladly accepted the order, and led his two brothers, Tommen Peak and Peckwood Peak, to Dorne. Dorne then launched a war to attack the Borderlands. The Lords of the Borderlands united to fight against the invaders, and were eventually defeated. Before this battle, Leswell Peak had contacted his distant relative Titus Peak of Starspot City, hoping that he could raid the Borderlands army from behind. But this proposal was firmly rejected by Titus. First, he did not like his poor relative who was in exile, and second, Titus was still confident in his feudal lord, the Tyrell family. He did not expect the Borderland army to fail so quickly, and he did not expect that, after conquering Night Song City, the Dornishmen did not continue to attack the Borderland, but went straight to Highgarden. Then when Titus panicked, and found his poor relative Leswell Peak, the situation was reversed, and Leswell became arrogant. At the same time, Titus' wife Margot Lannister was also in trouble. Leswell had long been eyeing this beautiful blonde sister-in-law. Titus humiliated himself and handed over his wife to Leswell's room. The reason was that Leswell claimed that His Majesty the King did not like the Lannister family, even though Margot Lannister, the Countess of Starsong City, was just a collateral woman of the Lannister family. The three brothers of Leswell Peak had a party every night in their room, and Earl Titus endured the humiliation and became the laughingstock of countless people, just in exchange for the hope that he could survive and the family would survive. However, just when Lord Titus thought that he had sacrificed a wife and had won the support of the Dorne and Targaryen families, bad news suddenly came from the front. Lord Dundas Ironwood, the famous Stone Road Guardian, was attacked by the Hightower family while leading the Dorne army to besiege Highgarden. The reinforcement from Old Town and the army of the Tyrell family in Highgarden defeated the Dorne army. Afterwards, the Reach army did not let the Dorne army evacuate safely. The Dorne army retreated all the way to Starspur City before regaining its foothold. When Titus heard the news, it was like a bolt from the blue. He did not expect that when he occupied the Reach side, the Reach was defeated. Then he quickly stood on the side of Dorne, and Dorne also suffered a defeat. However, no matter where in the world, no one will show mercy to traitors. When Titus was at a loss, a servant in the castle suddenly found him. It turns out that this servant was actually a spy planted by the Tyrell family in Starspur. The heir of Highgarden, the actual commander of the Reach army, the cripple Willis, told him through this spy that if Titus did one thing, he would forgive his betrayal and rescue his wife. That night, in Starspur, Father Ser Roger Arlian of God's Grace sat at the table with one hand on the hilt of his sword. His father-in-law, Lord Dundas Ironwood, the commander of the Dorne army, had a gloomy face and was still studying the map at his desk. Since the defeat in the attack and defense of Highgarden, Anders had been unable to sleep for several nights. His son-in-law Roger Arlian saw it and was worried. He was not worried about the health of his father-in-law, but worried that, if such a powerful father-in-law fell, his own interests would be damaged. Moreover, the current situation of the Dorne army is not very good. The losses in the Battle of Highgarden are greater than everyone imagined. If they really lost the battle and returned to Dorne in disgrace, Prince Doran would blame them. Father, why don't we consider Willis's proposal? Roger Arlian looked at his father-in-law's face and then spoke tentatively. The army of the Reach now surrounded Starspur. The commander of the Reach army is nominally the Southern Guardian, Duke Mace Tyrell, but in fact everyone knows that the commander of the Reach army is Willis Tyrell, the eldest son of Duke Mace Tyrell. He integrated the armies of the Hightower family and the Tyrell family, led the troops to surround Starspur, and put on a posture of swallowing up all the Dorne army in one bite. At the same time, he also proposed the idea of peace talks. As long as Anders Ironwood surrenders, the Tyrell family is willing to help the Ironwood family defeat the Martell family, to seize Sunspear City and restore the glory of the Ironwood family as the High King of Dorne. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 533, Siege of Xingqiu City. Erlandus Ironwood, the commander of the Dornish army, was sitting in a wheelchair, studying the map, and thinking about how to defeat the enemy. He looked up when he heard his son-in-law's words. "Shut up." Anders Ironwood's hair was a little grey, and his brows were furrowed. He stared at his son-in-law Roger Arian, and then spoke in a stern tone. "Roger, don't say such things again." Although Anders' grandfather Edgar Ironwood had a duel with 16-year-old Baron 20 years ago because of his mistress's affair, both of them were slightly injured, but Edgar Ironwood died of suppuration of the wound a few days later. People suspected that a Baron had smeared poison on the sword, so he was called the Red Viper. This incident seriously affected the relationship between the Martel family and the Ironwood family. But the family relationship was not harmonious, and Prince Doran had a very close personal relationship with Anders Ironwood. The two were of similar age, and were good friends who could talk about anything. After a Baron's incident, in order to repair the relationship with the Ironwood family, Prince Doran gave his young eldest son Quentin Martel to Erlandus Ironwood, to raise as his adopted son, which was a kind of compensation and guarantee. Therefore, the relationship between the Martel family and the Ironwood family is still harmonious. Prince Doran values his good friend, and Anders also knows Prince Doran very well. Doran Mellis Martel is an extremely cautious and calm person. He acts carefully, plans and never shows his emotions. Although Prince Doran has now handed over the power of Dawn to Anders Ironwood, and appointed him as the commander of the entire army, to preside over the attack on the River Reach. But Anders knows very well that there are many spies of Prince Doran in the army, and he will not completely trust anyone. His son-in-law Roger Arian's words may reach Prince Doran's ears. Although restoring the glory of the ancestor of the Ironwood family, the High King of Dawn, was indeed tempting, Anders still calmly resisted this temptation. He knew that behind the benefits that were delivered to him, and could not be refused, there were often traps that could eat people. When Roger Arian saw that his father-in-law was angry, his expression on his face suddenly became a little embarrassed, but he did not dare to say anything more. However, at this moment, a noisy sound suddenly came from the outside world. "The city gate is open. The city gate is open. Kill." There were even faint shouts of killing, but the room where Anders Ironwood lived was far away, so he could not hear it clearly. "Listen." The Dawn commander sitting in a wheelchair and his son-in-law were both experienced warriors, and naturally they were very sensitive to some slight movements. "Father." Sir Roger's face changed slightly, and then he looked at his father-in-law, and stood up suddenly with one hand on the hilt of the sword. "Roger, go out and see what happened. Be careful." Anders Ironwood's expression did not change, and he seemed very calm, and then he ordered in a calm voice. "Yes, father." Then his son-in-law, Sir Roger Arian, pushed the door open with his hand on the hilt of his sword, and went out to check the situation outside. At the same time, he ordered the guards to strengthen the defense and protect the safety of his father-in-law. Outside, Puff, to speak, the Earl of Star Shuttle City, pulled out a Dawn soldier's chest with a bloody long sword in his hand, and then pushed his body off the city wall. Plop, the body fell to the dust. Titus Peak is still the Lord of Star Shuttle City after all. The Peak family was once glorious in history, and was one of the most prominent and powerful families in the River Bay. The ancestor was also a descendant of Garth Greenhand. It even ruled 3 castles at the same time. Today, the emblem of the Peak family still looks like 3 castles. They were briefly powerful in the post-Dance of the Dragons era, but they declined rapidly in modern times. Because the Peak family stood on the wrong side in several Blackfire rebellions, they were punished and deprived of the other 2 castles, leaving only Star Shuttle City. There are even jokes about the Peak family in the Reach. It is probably that a blind man can choose sides better than the adults of the Peak family. They are really good at choosing sides, and they have the attribute of poisonous milk. Whichever side they join will be unlucky. However, a lean camel is bigger than a horse. Titus Peak still summoned a group of soldiers loyal to the Peak family and suddenly launched a riot without any signs tonight. They suddenly attacked, killed all the defenders, quickly seized a gate of Star Shuttle City, and set a big fire on the top of the city, allowing the Reach army outside the city to enter the city. Perhaps because Earl Titus behaved too docilely some time ago, even offering his wife, he became a laughingstock of everyone. The Dawn army did not expect that this punching bag had the courage to suddenly attack, and was killed by surprise, and lost the city gate. Kill all these Dawn barbarians. Guard the city gate. Titus roared angrily with a bloody sword in hand. Kill. The soldiers of the Peak family also held their breath. Living in the wealthy Reach, they looked down on their poor neighbors, especially the Dornish, and privately called them barbarians. However, since Earl Titus surrendered, the Dornishmen who used to look down on them have been bullying them. The soldiers of Star Shuttle City have long been fed up with it. Now, of course, they are united, and are determined to defend the city gate they have just captured. A raging fire burned above Star Shuttle City, and civil strife broke out in the Dornish army. The Reach army that surrounded Star Shuttle City outside the city would naturally not miss this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The time for revenge has come. Father, Mace Tyrrell, the nominal commander of the entire army, looked at his son, and Willis did not hesitate, and decisively ordered an attack. They invaded our land, burned our homes, killed our children, and defiled our wives. We have suffered too much humiliation during this period, and this battle will give it all back to them. The heir to Highgarden, who has always been gentle, stood up with one of his legs, drew the long sword at his waist, and roared, "Kill all these barbarians." Hearing Willis' pre-war mobilization, all the knights of the River Bay who were ready to go in the central army tent suddenly felt their blood boiling. Bang bang bang. Then they all slapped the table in response, and then stood up, and drew the long swords at their waists, raising their arms and shouting, "Revenge. Blood debt must be paid with blood." Chapter 534, The Cripples Battle. Titus Peak, the Earl of Star Shuttle City, was indecisive, surrendered first and then rebelled. He successfully captured a city gate in a surprise attack, and held out until the reinforcement from the Reach arrived. The Dornish army also fought back when they encountered the surprise attack. The battlefields of the two sides were all over the inside and outside of Star Shuttle City, and shouts of killing were heard everywhere. Kill. Titus Peak, holding a long sword and covered in blood, chopped left and right, repelling wave after wave of attacks from the Dornish army, and then finally had time to breathe heavily. Boom boom. The knights of the Reach poured into the city, greatly relieving the pressure he was under. At this moment, it was late at night, and the flames in Star Shuttle City were soaring into the sky. I don't know which side ignited the kerosene, and the billowing smoke went straight into the sky. Earl Titus Peak looked at his home in the flames, and his heart was mixed. He seemed to regret jumping left and right to join the Reach camp again, but then he still strengthened his belief, and clenched his fists tightly. No, I don't regret it. He was originally a nobleman of the Reach, but he had gone astray before, and believed the rumors of the traitors, so he betrayed his hometown and the feudal lord he was loyal to. But now Titus Peck believes that he has embarked on the right path. Margot. Then Count Titus thought of his wife who was still in the clutches of the devil, and his heart ached. He felt sorry for his wife. Come. Everyone follow me. Looking at the chaotic battlefield under the city wall, Titus Peck's heart was made up. Holding a long sword in his hand, calling on all the soldiers of Star Shuttle City to follow him. No one would be more familiar with the terrain of Star Shuttle City than him. He wanted to lead the troops to rescue his wife, and kill the demons who defiled his wife with his own hands. On the other side, the fierce battle in Star Shuttle City continued. The kerosene stored in the city was detonated, and the blazing flames reflected the sky red. Hold on. Don't panic. Sir Roger Arian of God's Grace chopped and killed several deserters with a long sword in his hand, trying to control the whole chaotic situation. Although the Dornish army resisted stubbornly, the command was chaotic. Most of them fought on their own. Soldiers could not find their generals, and generals could not find their soldiers. Everyone listened to my orders. However, his roar had a small impact. Only the Dornish soldiers around him obeyed his orders. Bang. Then Roger Arian grabbed a passing Dornish nobleman, Andre Dart, the younger brother of Sir Denzel Dart, the Lemonwood Knight. The young Dornish warrior was panting at the moment, and his young face was still full of panic. This was his first time to participate in a battle. Although it was not the first time he killed someone, the battlefield and killing were two different things. A fierce murderer was nothing on the battlefield. On radar, Roger Arian grabbed the young Lemon Grove Knight by the collar. He didn't recognize the man in front of him, but he recognized him after taking a look at the emblem on his chest. Andre Dart's mind was blank at the moment. There were flames all around him, and enemies were everywhere, ready to rush out from any corner at any time. He was completely dizzy. At this moment, he was suddenly grabbed by the collar, and Andre Dart was about to attack. But when he saw that the other party was Sir Roger Arian of God's Grace, Lord Ironwood's son-in-law, he immediately became much more clear-headed and did not dare to act presumptuously. Roger Arian naturally did not need to consider what a young man who came to the army to gild his feet would think, and grabbed his collar and shouted loudly, "Go. Tell your brother to bring everyone to my side. Go." Then Roger Arian kicked the young Lemon Grove Knight on the butt. Yes. Andre Dart shuddered after receiving the order, then turned and ran to find his brother Denzel Dart. "Everyone come closer to me. Occupy the tower on that side. Quick, quick, quick." The battle in Star Shuttle City was fierce. After the initial panic, the Dawn Army quickly gained a firm foothold under command. The commander of the Dawn Army, Earl Anders Ironwood, sat in a wheelchair and occupied the commanding heights of Star Shuttle City to personally command the battle. His guards stood firm on the left and right, just repelling the attacks of several Riverland soldiers, killing them and throwing their bodies down. On the other side, the actual commander of the Riverland Army, the heir to Highgarden, Willis Tyrrell, who was also lame, also rode a warhorse to the front line of the battlefield regardless of danger. "Help me off the horse." Then he turned over and got off the warhorse with the help of the soldiers, with one hand still leaning on a crutch. He climbed up the wall of Star Shuttle City and overlooked the battlefield, personally commanding the battle. Swoosh, several stray arrows flew from the battlefield, but Willis Tyrrell remained fearless and insisted on staying on the front line with the soldiers. This war was extremely fierce and lasted for a whole night, mainly because the Dornish army was very tenacious. It was not until the sky was white that the situation on the battlefield gradually became clear. Although the Dornish army stubbornly resisted the attack of the Reach army, the soldiers around them became fewer and fewer, and the area controlled by the city was gradually compressed. The two sides repeatedly pulled in a small area in the city, leaving layers of corpses on the ground. In the end, the Dornish army was compressed to a place where only the central main castle was left, and the rest of the place was occupied by the Reach army. Earl Anders Ironwood, the commander of the Dornish army, was surrounded in this main castle, and there were many other Dornish nobles. The situation has become precarious. The war is over. Father. Bang. Sir Roger Arlean was covered in blood, and the blade of his sword was bent. He pushed open the door panting, and came to his father-in-law. "Reconsider it. For more brothers to survive." Anders Ironwood, who was sitting in a wheelchair, was silent, breathing heavily. On the other side, the war is over. Willis Tyrrell, who was leaning on a cane, looked at the situation on the battlefield, and finally breathed a sigh of relief, and showed a relaxed expression. His eyes were full of bloodshot. The soldiers fought fiercely all night, and he didn't sleep all night. "Fortunately, I have fulfilled my mission, father." Then Willis turned his head and looked at his father and his two brothers. Brave Garland Tyrrell, Willis's younger brother Loris. He was supposed to be sent to Storm's End as Renlisqua, but because of the war, he was unable to leave Highgarden. It was a coincidence that he escaped. Looking at his talented eldest son, Mace Tyrrell smiled with satisfaction. What a good boy. It would have been even better if Willis's leg hadn't been broken. However, at this moment, a faint roar seemed to be ringing, like thousands of horses galloping, or like thunder suddenly hitting the sky. What sound? Brave Garland Tyrrell was the first to react. He seemed to have heard something faintly, and then he looked up at the sky. Willis Tyrrell seemed to have heard the sound as well, and he looked up at the cloudless sky, and then his face suddenly changed. Chapter 535 Reinforcement arrive. Now the sky is clear. How could there be thunder? And if it is not thunder, then it will be Willis standing on the city wall with one hand on a cane, and then he could not help turning his head to look behind. The terrain of the Reach is flat and level. Outside the Star Shuttle City is an open field with no end in sight. The morning sun shines on the ground, and the wind blows the grass leaves slightly lower. And at the end of the horizon, the faint sound of thunder becomes heavier and heavier. Rumble, not only Willis, but also Gon Tyrrell, little Loris, their father Duke Mace, and ordinary soldiers of the Reach under the city wall. They all noticed the abnormality, and turned their heads to look behind. What is this sound? The plump and fat Lord Mace Tyrrell showed a puzzled expression on his face, and then turned his head to ask his eldest son, but saw Willis's extremely ugly face. Prepare for battle. Prepare for battle. Willis's face became nervous, and he did not bother to explain to his father. He supported himself with a cane, and walked to the wall with great effort, then shouted loudly to the soldiers of the Tyrrell family below. Everyone line up. Face the back. Quick. Many soldiers in the Reach, who were in the back, were still confused when they heard Willis Tyrrell's order, not knowing what was going on. Their enemies were clearly in front, so why did they line up facing the back? Aren't we going to win this battle? What happened again? Some soldiers stood in the crooked team with spears in their hands, and asked in confusion. Who knows? Another soldier next to him shrugged his shoulders indifferently. The Reach was the same as the Stormlands. Years of war led to a serious shortage of soldiers, and then a lot of strong men were captured to fill in. In addition, the population of the Reach was already abundant, which caused the overall quality of the army to decline. Everyone line up immediately. Willis's eldest brother, brave Gon Tyrrell, also reacted at this moment, and knew why his eldest brother was so anxious. He hurried down from the wall, then mounted his warhorse, drew the long sword from his waist, and ordered loudly, line up. Move. Hurry up. The area of Star Shuttle City is not very large. The Dornishman's camp was set up outside Star Shuttle City before. Last night, the battle between the two armies spread all over the inside and outside of the castle. Now there are still a large number of River Reach troops outside Star Shuttle City who have no way to enter the castle, so naturally they cannot close the city gate. They don't have the courage to abandon so many River Reach soldiers outside the city, which is equivalent to ruining the hope of the River Reach. Leave the city. Line up outside the city. Prepare to meet the enemy. Hold the city gate. Willis held the battlement and ordered loudly, and the soldiers of the River Reach suddenly moved. They picked up their weapons, ran out of the city in a mess, and formed a formation outside. However, before they could gain a firm foothold, the rolling thunder at the end of the horizon in the distance became louder and louder. Rumble, the first high-speed galloping warhorse, appeared, followed by the second, the third, and countless warhorses galloped one after another, their hooves stomping hard on the ground, stirring up dust and grass leaves. On the horses' backs sat Dothraki warriors wearing animal skin armor and roaring. They brandished their araks in the dazzling sunlight, reflecting the cold light, and let out sharp and piercing howls. It was like the howling of ghosts and wolves, with extremely strong penetrating power, spreading across the entire battlefield, coupled with the powerful pressure of thousands of horses galloping. Countless soldiers in the Reach had never seen such a scene before, and they all rolled their throats and swallowed a mouthful of saliva. On the wall of Star Shuttle City, the face of Mace Tyrrell, Duke of Highgarden, was also slightly pale. Is this the barbarian army under Viserys? He had heard that Viserys had a Dothraki army under his command, but for the High Lord of the Reach and the Warden of the South in Westeros, the Dothraki active in another continent was just a legend. And Willis, who was beside Mace Tyrrell, stared blankly at the endless Dothraki cavalry rushing towards him in the distance, and his mind felt blank. Although he was diligent and studious and familiar with military strategies, it was also the first time for him to see such an enemy. This was an opponent that was not mentioned in all the books that Willis had read to teach him how to fight. No, it was mentioned. Willis suddenly thought of a book he had read, and then shuddered. 400 years before the War of the Usurper, Koha's 3,000 warriors successfully resisted the attack of more than 20,000 Dothraki warriors of Temocal and defended Koha. After the battle, his sons, including Kaltimo, all the Khors, 3 Bloodridders, and 12,000 Dothraki warriors fell on the battlefield. However, although he thought of the successful case of resisting the Dothraki, there was no joy on Willis's face. Because in the famous Battle of Koha, the two protagonists, the Dothraki and the Unsullied, were on the enemy's side. The only thing that can be reproduced is that they are now fighting with their backs to the city, which is equivalent to the 3,000 warriors of that year. Hold your position. Be brave. Boys, be brave. Seeing the dazed look on the face of his proud eldest son Willis, Duke Mace, who knew that his ability was relatively mediocre, took the initiative to stand in front of the children and spoke loudly. Hold your spears tightly. There is nothing to be afraid of. The two brown mustaches of the Duke of Mace trembled slightly, and his fists were clenched tightly, and his palms were full of sweat. He said that there was nothing to be afraid of, but in fact he was more afraid than anyone else, but he couldn't show it in front of the soldiers and children. The Duke of Highgarden took the initiative to boost the morale of the soldiers, which had some effect. When the soldiers saw that the usually high-ranking Duke Mace Tyrrell was personally on the front line with them, the tension in their hearts subsided a lot, and they all clenched their spears. As the actual commander of the River Reach army, Willis finally came to his senses at this time. He looked at his father in front of him, took a deep breath, and then spoke loudly. Keep the formation. Raise the shield. Ready the spears. Wow. Rows of spears were placed in the gaps of the shields and raised high. Feeling the slight tremor of the ground and the sound of horses' hooves getting closer and closer, all the soldiers of the River Reach hiding in the shield formation swallowed their saliva again, and their hearts beat faster and faster with the sound of horses' hooves. Chapter 536 Massacre. However, the imagined situation was very beautiful, but in reality, the army of the Reach was too large and bloated, and the command system and system of this era were also very backward. Willis hastily ordered to turn around and face the enemy behind, but it would take a long time for all the soldiers to receive the order. Even the soldiers in front were still attacking the last remnants of Dawn and had no idea what was happening behind. The soldiers behind were mainly freshly captured strong men and recruits who had not been trained. It took them a certain amount of time to stand in line under Willis's command. Even the team in the middle had already stood up and set up a spear and shield formation, while the formation on the edge was still in a mess. Some soldiers held their spears in their hands and didn't know where their team had gone. But the Dothraki did not give them a chance to fully adjust, let alone give the recruits time to find their team positions. They waved their scimitars in the dazzling sunlight, howling like wolves, rushing from all directions. The Dothraki charged at a very fast speed. When Willis found them, they were still at the end of the horizon. They rushed to him in the blink of an eye. For the dragon riding Cal. For Khaleesi. Because they had witnessed Rhaenys riding a dragon and defeating them, the Dothraki admired the strong. Therefore, among the Dothraki, Rhaenys had a reputation second only to Viserys. She was regarded as a god by this group of grassland knights with serious superstition. Kill all these people wearing iron clothes. Tear down their stone houses. Cargo drew out the Valyrian steel arak from his waist and roared. Hold your position. No one is allowed to waver. On the top of the city of Star Shuttle, Willis also drew out his long sword and roared. Then, like the rising tide of the sea, the endless Dothraki army finally crashed heavily into the army of the Reach. Boom boom boom, strong grassland war horses blindfolded their eyes and slammed into the shield formation of the Riverbend army. The spears pierced the horses' bodies, making painful cries, but the heavy bodies of the horses still knocked the shield formation crooked, like messy leaves in the wind. The Dothraki warriors on horseback also fell to the ground, and before they could fight back, they were pierced into sieves by countless spears, and fell into a pool of blood. However, the Dothraki army naturally had more than one war horse to attack the formation. The overwhelming war horses and the grassland knights on horseback did not fear death at all, and they all rushed towards the shield formation. In an instant, the solid formation of the Riverbend army was smashed into pieces. The Dothraki people saw death as home, and they believed that warriors who died on the battlefield would become one of the stars in the sky, while cowards did not have this qualification, and were not qualified to be cremated, and remained on the ground, and turned into soil. Kill this man in iron clothes. On the chaotic battlefield, a tribe member, Casco, swung the lasso in his hand skillfully. Then he seized the opportunity and threw it out, accurately catching the neck of a Riverbend knight who was hiding behind the shield formation and had the Zenford family emblem on his chest. Then he pulled hard and pulled the Zenford family knight off the horse unexpectedly. He fell heavily to the ground and was dragged out like a dead dog. All this happened too quickly. Sir Zenford tightly grasped the lasso around his neck, his face flushed red, and he was almost strangled to death. Others didn't even have time to help. And here, a hole appeared in the solid shield formation of the river bend in an instant. Seeing their own bandits succeed, the Dothraki people suddenly cheered. Then they urged their horses to crash into the formation hole opened by their own strength, expanding the hole in the shield formation infinitely. The unfortunate Zenford knight was trampled under the feet of countless horses, his armor was crushed, blood spurted out of his mouth, his cheeks were bloody, and he died with desperate screams. War broke out outside the city, and the Dothraki attacked. The Dornish army was still defending the small-scale buildings and land in Star Shuttle City, including the main castle tower on the commanding heights. The commander of the Dornish army, Earl Anders Ironwood, had already fallen into despair. Sitting in a wheelchair, he began to consider surrendering, but he did not expect to survive. There is always a way out. Earl Anders' hair turned a lot white overnight, but when he saw the endless Dothraki army attacking, he immediately recovered all his energy and spirit, became excited again, closed his eyes slightly, and then opened them again. Fight back. Tell all the soldiers that reinforcements are coming. Then the Dornish army, who had been frustrated all night, rushed out of the castle again. Kill. They cooperated with the Dothraki army and recreated the Battle of Highgarden, sandwiching the army of the Reach in the middle. On the other side, to speak, the Earl of Starsput led his soldiers to rescue his wife, but he was careless and was pushed off the city wall by his distant cousin Leswell Peak in a one-on-one duel and fell to his death. Willis Tyrrell, the commander of the Reach and the heir to Highgarden, felt his hands and feet cold when he saw the battle in front of him. Although he loved reading and often went back and forth to the Citadel, he learned a lot of military strategies from Dr. Nemes, a doctor of military science who wore an iron mask, a scepter and a ring, but he had no practical experience. In theory, Dr. Nemes of the Citadel should be the commander who is most proficient in military strategies in the Seven Kingdoms, because he is a doctor of military science, representing unparalleled achievements in this area. However, Dr. Nemes, who has studied countless classic battles of ancient and modern times for a lifetime, and is proficient in command skills and combat methods, has never led even a single soldier in his life. Willis Tyrrell is his student. He won the defense of Highgarden in his first battle by following the methods in the book, and defeated the Dornish commander Anders Ironwood. He should be proud of it. However, the book never taught what to do if an unexpected situation occurred. Now the entire battlefield has become corrupted, and the army of the Reach has been completely dispersed by the Dothraki army, and has become scattered. The Dornish army also took the opportunity to rush out, and the two sides cooperated inside and outside, becoming a one-sided massacre of the soldiers of the Reach. There were screams everywhere, and the soldiers of the Reach fled in all directions, but they could not outrun the horses of the Dothraki, and were chopped to death one after another. It's over. With Willis's knowledge, he understood that the current situation has reached an irreversible level. Garland, protect my father and Loras and escape together. Then Willis, holding the battlement with his hands, closed his eyes in pain, and finally made a decision. He spoke hoarsely without turning his head. Chapter 537 Duel. Brother, what about you? Garland was shocked when he heard his brother's words. Now Lord Mace Tyrrell and his youngest son Loras have changed their clothes, and are ready to find an opportunity to rush out. There are still so many soldiers here, so many men from the Reach, and the war is not over yet. I want to stay here, Willis said hoarsely, holding the battlements. Don't worry, I'm more useful alive, and they won't kill me easily. Willis was determined, and would not allow any rebuttal, even if his father and brother persuaded him. Then Garland had no choice but to take his father and brother and rush out of the city through the small gate under the protection of the guards. Willis was determined to live and die with more soldiers from the Reach. He stood on the top of the city and watched his father and his two brothers go away. However, he did not expect that this team that wanted to quietly escape from Star Shuttle City was spotted by the Dothraki shortly after leaving the city through the small gate. Roar, roar, roar. A team of Dothraki warriors on their horses howled and quickly chased up, surrounding the carriage and the guards of the Tyrrell family, looking for death. When brave Garland Tyrrell saw the Dothraki chasing him, he was shocked and angry, and then he fought back with his spear in hand. The title of Brave Garland was given to him by his brother Willis, because Garland was fat when he was young. Willis was afraid that his younger brother would be bullied, so he gave him a nickname Brave Garland to protect his younger brother from being laughed at. When Garland grew up, he did not live up to the nickname given by his brother. He was tall and strong, far superior to his older and younger brothers, and his swordsmanship was excellent. He could deal with 3 or 4 soldiers at the same time. However, Garland Tyrrell, who practiced swordsmanship in the castle, was still too immature to face the real killer. The Dothraki grew up in a much crueler environment than him, and their fighting skills were more practical. What's more, Garland Tyrrell was facing Viserys' Bloodridders. Cargo, the commander of the entire Dothraki army. Cargo saw a carriage coming out of Star Shuttle City at a glance, and knew that it must be carrying important figures in the city, who wanted to take the opportunity to slip away when they saw that they were about to lose the battle. So Cargo led a dozen Dothraki warriors around him to chase after them, ready to kill the group of people. Garland Tyrrell was wearing bright armor, and he jumped on his horse and thrust his spear straight into Cargo's chest, but the agile Dothraki warrior dodged it by lying on his horse's back. Clang clang. Then the weapons of the two collided violently, and 2 clear scars appeared on Garland's spear, and the spearhead was almost cut off by the Valyrian steel knife. Valyrian steel? Garland was a little surprised and angry. He didn't expect a barbarian to wield a Valyrian steel weapon. Then the two met, turned their horses' heads again and killed again. This time, Cargo was no longer merciful. He seemed to be getting excited when he met a suitable opponent. Cargo took off his animal skin armor, revealing his strong and dark muscles. He waved his arak in his hand and rode over again. Then, at the moment when the 2 horses crossed, he directly possessed himself, clamped his legs around the horse's belly, controlled himself not to fall off, and cut off Garland Tyrrell's horse leg with 1 knife. Cutting the horse's leg is one of the Dothraki's usual fighting techniques, and the proud Rose family knight was caught off guard. Where had he seen such a despicable move? The war horse neighed in pain, and Garland Tyrrell on the horse's back fell to the ground with his horse. His helmet was flattened, and he was dizzy. Damn it. Garland Tyrrell lay on the ground for a long time before he came to his senses again. PFFT. He got up in a mess, spat out the dirt in his mouth, knelt on one knee, and then took off the helmet that was crushed on his head and threw it on the ground. Garland Tyrrell wanted to scold the other party for not following martial ethics and having no honor, but then he thought that the other party was an uncivilized barbarian and he couldn't speak the language, so he could only spit out the blood and phlegm in his mouth again. It seemed that the fool just now loosened his teeth. Whoa. On the other side, Kago seemed to be in a good mood. He cut off the horse's leg of the Knight of the Rose, but he didn't take advantage of the other party. He also turned over and jumped off the horse. He threw the scimitar in his hand to the side and then pulled out 2 daggers from his waist and threw them on the ground. Kago threw away all the weapons on his body, barehanded, opened his arms, exposed his chest, and arrogantly challenged in Dothraki. Hey. Trample, tramp, tramp. The surrounding horses' hoof sounds were chaotic and noisy. The Dothraki warriors raised their swords and fell, and the guards of the Tyrrell family below screamed. They were no match for this group of Dothraki, and they were killed in an instant, leaving only the trembling Lord Mace Tyrrell and the father and son of little Loras hiding in the carriage. They were roughly pulled out of the carriage, pushed and knelt on the ground, and the scimitars were pressed on their necks. Shiftik. The surrounding Dothraki rode on war horses, with contempt and ridicule on their faces, and one of them even kicked Mace Tyrrell's butt. They were mocking the Duke of Highgarden like a fat pig, cowardly, abandoning his warriors and running away. They looked down on this kind of people the most, and in the Dothraki language, such people are associated with cockroaches. On the other side, Garland Tyrrell threw off his helmet at this moment, with disheveled hair, looking a little embarrassed. He didn't understand what the Dothraki in front of him was saying, but he could see the provocation on his face. His father and brother had been caught by the other party, with a knife on their necks. Damn barbarians. Garland was so angry that he trembled all over, gasping for breath, and cursed fearlessly. Then he threw away the spear in his hand that was not convenient for fighting on foot, drew his long sword from his waist with a clang, and pointed it directly at the other party. He did not choose to kneel and surrender to the barbarians who invaded his homeland, but fought to the death like his brother. Because he knew that facing this group of barbarians who could not speak the same language, the nobles' game of nobility would not work. Instead of tarnishing their honor and kneeling to die, it would be better to choose to die standing. If they could kill the other party, it would be a profit. Come on. The Knight of the River Reach was surrounded by the enemy, drew his sword and roared. The Dothraki who surrounded the battlefield saw that the enemy had accepted Kago's challenge, and they all raised their scimitars and cheered. The Dothraki respected warriors and despised cowards. Roar, roar, roar. Chapter 538 Beheading. Kill. Then the Reach Knight roared, holding a long sword, and suddenly rushed forward, slashing at the blood-redder Kago with a sword. Kago threw away all the weapons in his hands at this moment. He was unarmed and not wearing armor. Facing this brave Reach Knight, he was very flexible. Whoosh, Galanteril slashed the sword in the air, and Kago easily dodged his attack. The long blade swung and slapped on his strong back, and the bells on the blade made a sound. Whoosh whoosh. Then the Reach Knight waved his long sword and approached step by step, wanting to kill this arrogant Dothraki, but Kago dodged them one by one. Whoosh, Galanteril swept the sword again, and Kago's long blade swung, and he came behind him sideways. Come. Kill me. They can live. The Dothraki warrior dodged Galanteril's attack easily, pounded his strong chest with one hand, and roared loudly in the broken common language. Come. He has been following Viserys for so long, and it has been a year since he came to Westeros, so he naturally learned some common language. Kago pointed at Mace Tyrell and Garland's younger brother Loras, who were pinned to the ground on the other side. At this time, Loras was not the Knight of Flowers, but just a boy who had not grown up, and the fear on his face was difficult to hide. Kago's meaning was very clear. If Garland Tyrell could defeat him, these two people could live, and if Garland could not defeat him, these two people would be buried with Garland, and the three of them would go to the underworld together. This is actually an ancient custom of the Dothraki people. The cows of the Dothraki people established their prestige in duels one after another. Therefore, the leaders of the tribes would look for opportunities to duel one-on-one with the enemy's warriors on the battlefield. Brother, save me. I don't want to die yet. The brother's terrified cry for help made Garland Tyrell, who was in the duel, feel more pressure. Loras the brown-haired knight's forehead was covered with cold sweat, and he felt the palm of his sword was full of sweat. He was a little flustered after repeated failed attacks. His breathing was rapid, and he stared at the Dothraki leader in front of him, who was obviously unarmed but full of dangerous aura, looking for the flaws in the other party. Die. Then Garland Tyrell seemed to have found an opportunity, and he roared again and rushed forward, stabbing a sword straight into Kago's chest. However, the flaw that the River Reach Knight saw was a trap deliberately exposed by Kago, who was experienced in duels, to lure Garland Tyrell into the trap. Kill. Garland Tyrell stabbed the air with a sword again, and swept another sword with his backhand, but was still dodged by Kago with a roll, and then kicked him in the knee from behind. Plop. The Knight of the Reach, wearing heavy armor, suddenly lost his balance and fell directly to the ground, once again becoming shabby and embarrassed, and even the long sword in his hand almost fell out. Brother, be careful. Please, save me. I don't want to die yet. And Loras's crying voice made Garland Tyrell even more nervous. Cold sweat kept sliding down his forehead, and his breathing was rapid. Get out of here. He didn't dare to neglect, after being kicked to the ground, and swept his sword to force back the rushing Kago. Then he supported the ground with his long sword and climbed up again in a mess, holding the hilt tightly with both hands. It's okay, Loras. Don't worry. Brother will definitely save you. Garland Tyrell panted heavily and promised in a somewhat empty voice. The surrounding Dothraki warriors raised their scimitars and continued to make a noise. Lajat. Kago roared in the Dothraki language for fighting. He opened his arms, showing his strong chest, and let the surrounding tribesmen admire him. His long braids hung down his back, and then he opened his chest and approached Garland Tyrell without any defense. The Knight of the River Reach was finally completely enraged by the other party's arrogant attitude. He panted and roared, and once again took the initiative to rush forward. Snap, but this time Garland Tyrell was too impatient and eager to succeed. The floor was too big for Kago to seize the opportunity to get close to him, and the wrist holding the sword was directly grabbed by the Dothraki. Oops. The brown-haired knight was slightly startled, and then horrified. However, he tried hard to pull out his wrist, but failed. Kago's palm was like a pair of pliers, holding his wrist tightly. Then before Galantiril could react, Kago punched him directly on the cheek. Bang! Kago's punch was so powerful that Galantiril was dizzy. Then he opened his hands and inserted 2 fingers into his eye sockets like 2 hooks, digging out the eyes of the Knight of the Reach. The intense pain hit him, and his mind went blank. The knight in armor suddenly trembled violently, his knees weakened, and he fell to the ground with a plop. Hot blood flowed out of his eyes in an instant. Ah! The Knight of the Reach knelt on his knees and screamed in extreme pain, which made the people around him shudder. Ah! Galantiril's eyes were dug out, and he fell to the ground in pain, and his long sword naturally fell. Kago bent down to pick up his long sword, opened his arms, and enjoyed the cheers of the surrounding Dothraki warriors when they saw his victory. Oh, no. On the other side, Lord Mace Tyrrell, who was pressed to the ground, saw this scene, and showed a look of horror on his face. Because he already knew what would happen next. Stop. Please. Let him go. The Duke of Highgarden shouted desperately, trying to stop what was going to happen next, but it didn't work. Kago came to the back of Galantiril with this seldom used weapon in his hand. The River Reach Knight's eyes were locked, blood was flowing from his eye sockets, and he was kneeling on the ground, covering his eyes in pain, not knowing what was happening around him. Then, in the bright sunlight, Kago raised the long sword in his hand high, reflecting the light slightly, and then slowly stabbed it into the gap at the neck of Galantiril's armor. However, this time the River Reach Knight did not scream, and blood spurted out of his mouth. Instead, it was a relief for him. The blood quickly overflowed from the gap in the armor, and the body fell to the ground with a plop. Kago executed the other party involved in the duel. The duel ended, and cheers broke out again around. This is also one of the rules of the Dothraki. Participating in a duel must end with the death of one party. Since Galantiril agreed to the duel, even if Kago wanted to let him go, he couldn't spare his life. On the other side, Galantiril, the second son of the Tyrrell family, was executed, and Mace Tyrrell, Duke of Highgarden, and his youngest son, Loras, were also beheaded. The Dothraki scimitars were very sharp, and they were very skilled in chopping people. The two did not feel any pain. Under the gaze of Willis, they bid farewell to this world directly, and their heads rolled to the ground. No, on the wall of Star Shuttle City, the Lame Highgarden there watched his second brother die in despair, and his father and younger brother were beheaded, but he was powerless to stop it. In fact, this war ended when the Dothraki suddenly appeared from behind the army of the River Reach. The army of the River Reach suffered a brutal massacre, with heavy casualties and blood staining the earth red. Willis Tyrrell was captured by the Dawn Army, and became the luckiest person in the Tyrrell family. If he fell into the hands of the Dothraki, his life might not be saved. On the second day after the war, a giant dragon appeared in the sky, and Viserys came from Storm's End riding Balerion. Chapter 539 Celebration. Viserys rode a black dragon from Storm's End, and appeared in Starspa. Since the beginning of the new year, the Targaryen army has achieved fruitful results, winning 2 large-scale battles in a short period of half a month. The scale of the Battle of the Cripple in Starspa was even larger than the Battle of Bronze Gate in the Stormlands, because the Reach had more troops, far more than the Dawn Army. According to intelligence, before the invasion of the White Walkers, the standing army of the Reach could reach more than 30,000 people, and after the outbreak of the war, the army could be expanded to 80,000 to 100,000 people. However, these well-equipped Reach troops were buried in the Battle of Starspa, and were attacked and massacred by the Dothraki. The losses in the first battle were extremely heavy. Highgarden Duke Mace Tyrrell and his youngest son Loras were beheaded. Tyrrell family heir Willis was captured alive, and the second son Brave Galantiril died in battle. Out of respect for the Dothraki, his body was cremated with their warriors. Your Majesty, Your Majesty. With a bang, Viserys appeared in the hall of Star Shuttle City. The Dornish nobles, led by Anders Ironwood, who were sitting on one side of the hall, hurriedly pushed their chairs and stood up to salute. They dared not neglect this king who had conquered the world. Although Viserys was young, he acted decisively and killed as many people as anyone present. Although his face was handsome, his eyes and eyebrows contained murderous intent. A person's temperament was definitely related to something he had done. Cal riding a dragon. Blood of my blood. The other side of the hall of Star Shuttle City was filled with Dothraki tribal leaders. Viserys' blood guard Cargo sat in the first place, and the powerful Casco in the tribe was next to him. They were all fierce and lined up at the end of the hall. Although they were dressed in fancy clothes, animal skin armor, bronze belts, horsehair leggings, and even after killing people yesterday, they did not change their clothes and costumes, and there were still traces of blood on their bodies, exuding a strong murderous aura, but they still stood up and saluted when they saw Viserys coming. Seeing that Viserys could make these arrogant barbarians so obedient, the Dornish nobles sitting opposite could not help but look at each other and saw the shock in each other's eyes. The Dornish people seemed somewhat out of tune with other places in the Seven Kingdoms because of their national culture, religious customs and other reasons, and have always been despised by the mainstream areas of the Seven Kingdoms as barbarians. However, when the Dornish saw the Dothraki and dealt with them, they suddenly felt that they were too civilized. These people are the real barbarians, burning, killing, looting, and doing all kinds of evil. Defeating the River Reach army, which was twice as large as their own yesterday, was like a simple exercise after breakfast, and they defeated the River Reach army. If Andaziran had not interceded for his enemies, I'm afraid all the captured prisoners in the Reach would have been slaughtered. Because when the Dothraki fought, they would never leave behind any boy older than the wheel except for selling slaves. When they grow up, they will take revenge on the murderers of their fathers. For a race that lives on primitive rules as a civilization, rooting out the enemy is the simplest, most direct and effective way for them to deal with the enemy. Little Loras died for this reason. He could have escaped by luck, but the boy was too well nourished on weekdays and grew a little taller than his peers. The Dornish people thought that these Dothraki were thugs hired by Viserys Targaryen, but they didn't expect these people to be so well behaved when they saw him. Viserys nodded slightly, strode past them, and then sat on the main seat in the hall of Star Shuttle City, and then raised his hand. Sit. Hula. Then the Dornish nobles and the leaders of the Dothraki tribe standing on both sides of the hall sat back in their original seats. Your Majesty, thank you for your army's timely rescue. After everyone sat down, Lord Andaziran, the commander of the Dornish army, who was on Viserys' right hand, thanked him with a slightly embarrassed look. Of course, he had to thank Viserys for sending troops to rescue. If the Dothraki had not arrived at the battlefield in time and defeated the army of the Reach, the Dornish would probably have been annihilated. Their original core goal was to help the Iron Throne seize the Reach, but they did not expect to defeat Highgarden instead of taking it. Your people don't seem to be very good at fighting. A Casco sitting opposite him stepped on the leg of the stool, raised his chin slightly, looked arrogant, and spoke contemptuously in Dothraki. He didn't know what the person opposite was saying, but fortunately the Dornishman couldn't understand what the Dothraki was saying, but the faint laughter on the other side made the Dornishman's cheeks a little embarrassed. But he did lose the battle, and the man on the other side was his savior. Even if the Dornish were embarrassed, they didn't dare to get angry. Because the Dothraki were even more barbaric than them, the local hooligans could only smile awkwardly when they met those who didn't care about their lives. Viserys naturally understood the Dothraki language. He sat in the main seat and glanced at the other side. The laughter of the Dothraki people who didn't have any court rules suddenly stopped, like a rooster with its neck pinched. Then Viserys retracted his gaze and looked at Lord Andaziran and said, "The Targaryen family has always had a close relationship with Dorne. My queen is also from Dorne, and my daughter Dina has half of Dorne's blood flowing in her body. We have always been friends." Viserys raised the wine glass beside him and gestured to the guard. The Dothraki guard was stunned for a moment, and then he quickly picked up the wine pot and filled their cal. The Dornish were friendly troops, while the Dothraki were his personal troops. Viserys could certainly tell the difference. When he arrived at Starsput City, there were no other troops around him, so the Dothraki served as his guards. However, some of these guards were not very competent, with almost zero emotional intelligence, and they needed Viserys hints to understand. Then Viserys raised his glass to the friendship between Dorne and the Targaryen family. The Dornish nobles and Dothraki tribal leaders below also raised their glasses, and the Dornish nobles spoke in unison. "To your majesty, may your reign be long." The Dothraki were a little confused, saying all kinds of things. Some said they were toasting to the great cow, some were riding the world's steed, and some said that the cow didn't actually need the iron chair, he only needed the dragon. It started neatly and ended sparsely. After 3 glasses of celebratory wine, it was time to get down to business. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 540, Kneeling. In this battle, the Dawn Army encountered the rebellion of Titus Peak, the Earl of Starspurt. The city gate was opened, so the army suffered heavy losses and was almost wiped out. Naturally, someone had to take the blame and bear the anger of the Dawn Army. But now Titus Peak was pushed off the city wall and died in the battle to rescue his wife, so naturally he could not be held responsible. As representatives of the Targaryen army, the 3 brothers Leswell Peak, Tommen Peak and Peckwood Peak of the Golden Company became the targets of hostility of the Dawn Army. In the name of Viserys' hatred of the Lannisters, they deceived Margot Lannister, the wife of the Earl of Starspurt, and locked her in the room every night, which angered her husband Titus Peak, which led to the rebellion of the Earl of Starspurt. Therefore, the Dawn Army naturally vented its anger on Leswell Peak and the other 2. But these 3 people are very special. They are from the Golden Company, and are representatives of the Targaryen army. The Dornishmen naturally did not have the courage to attack these 3 people without the permission of the Targaryen family. Therefore, Viserys happened to come to Starspur City, so the Dornish army came to the king to file a complaint, hoping that his majesty would enforce the law impartially and punish the criminals who cause major war negligence. The Dornishmen came to the Iron Throne to file a complaint. This was the first time Viserys heard of it. They usually punished criminals on their own initiative. When did they ever bother the Iron Throne? It seemed that the Dothraki, who were more barbaric than them, scared them. However, after hearing the cause and effect, Viserys did not condone his officers. After all, there are all kinds of forests for big birds, and Viserys certainly could not guarantee that all his army had no problems. What's more, they also robbed a noble lady in their own name. How could this be tolerated? When problems are found, they are solved. Viserys interrogated Leswell Peak and the other 2, and the 3 confessed to raping Lady Margaret Lannister. However, they cried out loudly for injustice, and did not think that it was their actions that led to Titus Peak's rebellion. But in the end, after the testimony of witnesses including Lady Margot Lannister and servants of Starshuttle, Viserys sentenced the 3 to death, and sent them to the gallows to be hanged. The Dornish protest to the king was over, and the next step was the judgment on the Tyrell family. After Viserys flew to Starshuttle, he knew that Willis had been captured alive. Lord Mace Tyrell and his youngest son Loras had been executed, and the second son of the Tyrell family, Garland, died on the battlefield. He didn't have a deep impression of this Lord Mace Tyrell, and he didn't have many scenes. He knew that he had a beautiful little daughter. To Viserys, he was just a duke who was not very capable and even a little mediocre. The death of the future Knight of Flowers made Viserys sigh a little. Fate is unpredictable. He seemed to have never met Renly, and didn't know what he liked. He hoped that the 2 of them could meet again in the underground. Then, accompanied by the sound of heavy chains, Willis Tyrell, the only captured prisoner of the Tyrell family, was escorted up. One of his feet had been left with a lifelong disability in the duel with a baron, and he became Cripple Willis from then on. The Tyrell family and the Martell family were also at odds, and a baron was indeed a complete troublemaker when he was young. But Willis never seemed to blame a baron. After all, it was indeed his own poor skills that caused him to fall off the horse and break his leg, and the 2 of them still exchanged letters. Your Majesty. Willis' hands and feet were tied with shackles. His hair was disheveled, and he looked a little embarrassed, but his eyes were still bright, and his mental state was much better than yesterday. Willis witnessed the murder of his father and 2 brothers yesterday, and was almost emotionally broken. He even wanted to commit suicide, but he persuaded himself to hold on. Everything was for the continuation of the Tyrell family. Viserys looked at the disheveled, lame, and shackled heir of Highgarden in front of him, and couldn't help but frown slightly. Unchain him. He's already like this. Are you still afraid that he will run away? A cripple with a disabled leg, who couldn't walk without a cane, had to be shackled. Viserys felt that it was indeed too much. Click. Then the two Dawn soldiers who escorted Willis untied the heavy chains for him, and pushed a chair for him to sit down. Willis sat on the chair and immediately breathed a sigh of relief. Thank you, Your Majesty. These shackles really made him, a disabled person, suffer a lot. Then the disheveled heir of Highgarden looked at Viserys with a sharp look and spoke. Actually, a baron persuaded me through letters a long time ago to lead the Tyrell family, to submit to the Iron Throne. Your Majesty has the legitimate right to inherit the Iron Throne, supported by the nobles, and loved by the people. And he has the support of dragons, the Golden Company and the Dothraki. No one can resist the offensive of the Targaryen army, no one. Willis didn't even blink when he mentioned the support of the nobles. It can be said that Viserys has almost no support from any nobles except Dawn, and it was all one bit by bit. And when he mentioned the murderer who killed his father and two brothers in his words, Willis's face did not change. Oh, then why didn't you lead the Tyrell family to submit to the orthodoxy of the Iron Throne? Viserys sat on the main seat of Star Shuttle City and looked at the heir of Highgarden, who was sitting on the chair below and was now a prisoner in prison. The other party had just witnessed the murder of his father and brother, and today he was able to cheer up and talk freely, which really made him look at him with a new look. Mace Tyrell did give birth to a good son. Because of the interests, Your Majesty, Willis answered without hesitation when he heard Viserys' question. A baron and I have discussed in letters what Your Majesty wants to do in the future. I personally agree with what Your Majesty has done. The unity of the country and the concentration of power in the king can avoid the outbreak of civil war to the greatest extent. But I'm the eldest son of Mace Tyrell and the eldest grandson of Olenna Redwyne, the Queen of Thorns. I can't just represent myself. What Your Majesty has done harms the interests of all nobles. In fact, the friendship between a baron and Willis can be traced back to the time of the Citadel. The two teenagers studied together in the Citadel and were classmates. A baron won 6 bachelor's chains, while Willis, as the eldest son, was also excellent in study, but he could not get a bachelor's chain. Because becoming a bachelor requires giving up one's surname, the Tyrell family will not allow the eldest son in the family to become a bachelor, so Willis once hated his identity. However, after Willis grew up, he had indifferent to this emotion, and understood what he should do. What now? What will you choose? Viserys looked at the heir of Highgarden with interest. I'm willing to persuade my grandmother to surrender and hand over Highgarden and the wealth of the Tyrell family in full in exchange for the continuation of the family, Willis said seriously. Chapter 541, Occupation of High Court. Willis Tyrell surrendered to Viserys and swore eternal loyalty to the Targaryen family. He was willing to give up Highgarden and all the wealth of the Tyrell family in exchange for the survival of the family. And Viserys also accepted Willis Tyrell's loyalty and did not kill them all, giving them a chance to survive. The next day, the Dawn army suffered heavy losses and temporarily stayed in Star Shuttle City to rest, while the Dothraki army repaired for 2 days, and then continued to march forward to Highgarden. Highgarden is a beautiful castle located on the banks of the Manda River in the River Bay. It is built entirely of white marble and is full of artistic atmosphere. The carefully trimmed plant maze, blooming flowers, courtyards, pools and artificial waterfalls are poetic and picturesque everywhere. This beautiful castle stands on a hill, overlooking the endless plains of the River Bay. The water of the Manda River below is clear and flows quietly. Standing on the balcony of the Highgarden Tower, you can see all the beautiful manors and scattered fields within a few leagues. However, the arrival of the Dothraki army destroyed this beautiful scenery that can only be seen in poetry, and suddenly the poetic atmosphere turned into a fierce battle. Roar, roar, roar. The magnificent scene of thousands of horses galloping can be seen from a distance. The wild grassland cavalry came to Highgarden, and the chaotic horses' hooves crushed the fields and the crops that had not yet grown. But now the beautiful garden castle has lost its beauty before it has been ravaged by the Dothraki. The war that Dawn besieged Highgarden not long ago destroyed this elegance and beauty. The garden castle has become a thorn castle full of spikes, with traces of war everywhere, and has not been properly repaired. In a towering white tower, on a protruding rooftop, a short old woman with a scarf on her head and silver hair was holding the white marble railing, overlooking the grassland cavalry that could not be seen at a glance in the distance. War was like a bandit, barging into the old woman's vision, trampling down the yellow sea of flowers that she loved to see most, and taking away her son and 2 grandsons. Although the Queen of Thorns was covered with thorns and could not help but stab you with a few words, Lady Elena was not a person who liked war. She preferred to solve problems in the way of the Tyrrell family, or it could be said that she led the Tyrrell family to become like this. At this time, a huge black dragon appeared in the sky, drilled out of the sea of clouds, and let out a low and melodious roar. A pair of scholar eyes overlooked the white castle below, and flapped its wings to fly around Highgarden. The soldiers in the castle were terrified, and did not dare to resist at all. The old woman stared at the dragon in the sky, with a look of horror in her eyes. Her pale and thin fingers tightly grasped the white marble railings, and her nails were slightly white. After all, although she had lived for more than 60 years, and was approaching 70, and was older than Lord Hoster Tully, whose head had been chopped off and stuck on a spear half a year ago, it was also her first time seeing a dragon. No matter who saw this monster that should have lived in a myth for the first time, how could they be indifferent? Even if they had full imaginations about dragons before, they couldn't help but immerse themselves in their violent beauty when they saw them for the first time. They were so frightened that they trembled and couldn't extricate themselves. Then the old woman with a veil on her head left the rooftop, tremblingly returned to her room, and closed the gorgeous golden hollow door. Not long after, rumble, the heavy door of Highgarden opened from the inside, and all the soldiers loyal to the Tyrrell family still had hesitation on their faces. They lined up into rows, and walked out of the city. Crash. Then they put down their weapons, and knelt on both sides of the road. Balerion only flew around Highgarden, and the beautiful capital of the Reach surrendered without a fight, without even Willis Tyrrell coming forward to persuade his grandmother. Viserys rode a white horse, and followed the army, while Willis Tyrrell also rode a horse, and followed beside him, looking at Highgarden with a complicated look. I heard of the title of the Queen of Thorns a long time ago. It seems that Lady Elena is indeed a smart person. Viserys held the reins in his hand, then turned his head and spoke to Willis. Willis's expression was a little complicated, with guilt, sadness and other emotions intertwined. He was a little ashamed to face his grandmother, mother, and sister. Because he was the commander of the army of the Reach, he should be responsible for the loss of the war and the deaths and injuries of family members. And now the direct line of the Highgarden Rose Tyrrell family. There is only one man, Willis, and the rest are women. But then Willis pulled himself together again, turned his head, and looked at Viserys and answered seriously. My grandmother is indeed a wise person, your majesty. And your majesty is the orthodox of the Iron Throne, carrying the will of heaven and the people, so my grandmother naturally dare not stop you. Otherwise Highgarden and Tyrrell will be reduced to ashes, and disappear forever in history. Although the army of the Reach suffered a disastrous defeat in Star Shuttle City, the Tyrrell family has a deep foundation and still has the strength to resist. However, the Queen of Thorns Elena did not lead the Tyrrell family to fight to the death, but chose to surrender directly. The Dothraki army controlled Highgarden and opened the warehouse of the Tyrrell family. The mountain of gold that was blinding enough to make everyone dumbfounded. On the other hand, Viserys would naturally not do such a vulgar thing himself. Robbing gold is indeed robbing gold. This thing can be done by others, but he cannot do it, or cannot do it openly. Just like Cargo could kill Mace Tyrrell, Garland and Loras at will, almost wiping out the Tyrrell family. And maybe Viserys could do the same, but he had to think twice before he did it. Otherwise, it is likely to have a counter effect. After all, in such an era, honor and faith are still deeply rooted. Viserys held the hilt of his sword and walked through the vibrant gardens, gorgeous courtyards and rippling pools. Highgarden is worthy of being the center of art in the Seven Kingdoms. There are artistic stone carvings, fountains, and marble columns everywhere. Grapes and roses decorate the walls and sculptures. Then he climbed to the top of the tall rotating tower. A wide corridor led directly to a spacious and gorgeous bedroom. The floor was covered with thick handmade carpets with exquisite patterns, which were worth a lot at first glance. Viserys pushed open the door. A silver-haired old woman wearing a veil in the room seemed to have been waiting for a long time. She was holding a brown-haired girl in her hand. Fighting is indeed not our strong point, Your Majesty. Chapter 542. Tearing up the letter of surrender. Did our soldiers fight bravely on the battlefield? Garland, Mace. Lady Olenna's opening remarks were simple. She looked up and asked. Viserys was silent for a moment, then smacked his lips and shook his head. Not much different from what I expected. Then he emphasized again. Sir Garland died in battle. Oh, I knew it, because we are the proud Golden Rose. After hearing Viserys' words, the old woman's expression was gloomy, and then she shook her head in self-mockery. Garland, this silly boy, is the most stubborn of the Tyrell family, and Mace, he has been a coward since he was a child. But we still chose to fight. Mace, Garland and the child Loras, perhaps their deaths are also destined. The silver-haired old woman recited these names one by one, her voice hoarse, although there was no expression on her face, but these names were all her flesh and blood and descendants. We paid a heavy price. Then, Lady Olenna, the Queen of Thorns, looked up and said to Viserys with her dim old eyes, we fought but lost, Your Majesty. We paid the price we deserved. You have a powerful army that can sweep all the nobles of the Seven Kingdoms, so the Iron Throne should naturally belong to you. But conquering the world and ruling the world are not the same thing. Lady Olenna's eyes were bright. A powerful army that sweeps across the Seven Kingdoms can help you unify the world, but it cannot help you govern the country. Although she lost the war and lost her son and grandson, the old woman still did not give up persuading Viserys to give up the plan of reform. She wanted to persuade Viserys by saying that the political system of the Seven Kingdoms since ancient times was aristocratic self-government. The Iron Throne was his, and the king was his too. He could command the nobles and wage wars at will, ask the nobles for money when he had no money, marry a beautiful and noble queen, and even have hundreds of mistresses like the mean King Egon, and enjoy countless wealth and glory. But the Queen of Thorns couldn't understand why Viserys had to take away the power of the nobles. As long as Viserys nodded, the Seven Kingdoms could be unified the next day, and everyone would be happy. Isn't that good? However, Lady Olenna firmly believed that conquering the world and ruling the world were not the same thing. Without the help of the nobles, Viserys would not be able to govern the country well. Therefore, she tried to persuade the silver-haired young man to give up his idea of change. After all, she had eaten more salt than Viserys had eaten rice. However, Viserys walked into this gorgeous room full of classical atmosphere and couldn't help looking around. Then his eyes fell on the brown girl and retracted his gaze. He heard the words of the Queen of Thorns, but shook his head slightly. Viserys pulled a chair and sat directly opposite her and then spoke. Lady Olenna, are the rules from ancient times necessarily right? The old woman with a head full of silver hair was slightly stunned when she heard the words. As the high and mighty Queen of Thorns, she had never thought about this question. Why are nobles noble? Then Viserys looked at the two grandparents in front of him and continued to ask in a calm voice. The old woman opened her mouth and was about to answer something, but was answered by Viserys. Because of noble blood? Because they are smarter or more capable? In fact, there are many famous stupid nobles in history. Viserys' words made Lady Olenna speechless. It seems that there is nothing special about nobles. Nobles are also human beings. They will die if a knife pierces their heart. When they get seriously ill in their old age, they will also pee and fart on their sick beds. They don't look noble at all, and their so-called noble blood does not seem to bring them any extraordinary features, such as being smarter or more powerful. If there are truly noble bloods on the continent of Westeros, it seems that only the Targaryen family and the Stark family can be regarded as noble. The Targaryen family has the blood of true dragons and can establish a very good relationship with dragons and become partners with each other. The blood of the Stark family is also very mysterious, with unknown origins. They have the talent to become green prophets and seem to have some kind of inseparable connection with the White Walkers and the Old Gods. Except for the Targaryen family and the Stark family, the rest of the families in the Seven Kingdoms seem to be just ordinary people who took the opportunity first and took the advantage of being the first to come. The old woman was somewhat speechless by Vizori's words. On the other side, the brown-haired girl still had tears in her eyes, and she looked at Vizori's with fear. Then Lady Elena, who was wearing a veil on her head, took a deep breath, smiled self-deprecatingly and shook her head. Old in the past, people called me the Queen of Thorns because they were always stabbed by my words, and they all said that my words were sharp and mean. But now I can't even say anything to a young man who is younger than Willis. After saying that, the old woman with a head full of silver hair raised her head and looked at Viserys and asked seriously, "In that case, your majesty, my son and 2 grandsons have all died at the hands of your soldiers. How are you going to punish the Tyrells?" Viserys looked at the Queen of Thorns and then spoke calmly, without question. "Leave all your wealth and leave Highgarden. Willis made a promise when he surrendered. But Highgarden is our home. Where can we go if we leave here?" Although Lady Elena had thought of this possible result in advance, she still couldn't help but twitching her cheeks. The intensity of this punishment was even more cruel than that of the Tullys in the Riverlands. It seemed that there was a big difference between surrendering early and surrendering late. The Tullys were only abandoned from their feudal status and the title of Duke, but they were still able to keep Reveron, while the Tyrells could not even keep Highgarden. Starspurt. The Peak family has no heirs. Viserys had already thought of a place for the Tyrells. In fact, before leaving, he had personally appointed Willis Tyrell as the Earl of Starspurt. The political implications of this made many Dornish nobles who watched the ceremony look sideways, and they couldn't help but talk about it, speculating what the political map of the kingdom would be like in the future. As for the Dothraki, they had never considered these issues at all. Their lives were nothing but eating, sleeping, and killing and sleeping. They couldn't figure out what the hidden meaning was when Viserys personally appointed Willis Tyrell as the Earl of Starspurt City, and they didn't want to think about it. The Dothraki army occupied Highgarden. Because there was no battle, there was no time to rest for too long this time, and then they went straight to the next target. Old Town. Wolves want to eat meat, and no one can stop them. Although Viserys was tolerant of the Tyrell family, it didn't mean that he didn't have a thunderous side. His Majesty stayed in Highgarden for a short time and tore up 3 letters of surrender from the Hightower family in succession. He decided to destroy the Hightower family of Old Town, the largest, richest and most powerful nobles in the River Reach. Chapter 543 Marguerite Tyrell. Although throughout human history, the Hightower family has always been a tepid image, preferring trade and disliking war. However, few people actually know that the Hightower family has always been a hidden overlord on the continent of Westeros. If the Targaryen family used to sit on the Iron Throne and was the co-lord of the 7 kingdoms, the Hightower family was a shadow of the Iron Throne. The Hightower family invested in the construction of the Citadel and was the boss behind the Citadel. The Citadel brought together books from all over the world and controlled the lifeblood of the nobles of the 7 kingdoms. These loyal scholars who gave advice and suggestions to the nobles, brought them back to life, informed them of the situation, and explored diligently, actually had a common home. That is, they all came from the Citadel. At the same time, the Church of the 7 Gods, which is believed by more than 70% of people on the continent of Westeros, also has its headquarters, the Starry Temple, in Old Town, which makes countless people fanatical, firm, and pious. The church that holds the core faith also has the shadow of the Hightower family behind it. One knowledge, one belief. The Hightower family holds the 2 most powerful weapons in the world. Although some people claim that the Hightower family is the family that controls the direction of Westeros history, even the chaos, rise and fall before the unification of the 7 kingdoms, the extinction of the dragons and the expulsion of the Targaryen family from the Iron Throne, were all assisted by the Hightower family, but there is no substantial evidence. And Viserys does not need to know whether the Hightower family has done those things. Maybe he doesn't know, maybe he knows. After all, he absorbed the power of the old gods and became a new generation of Green Prophet. He should know something. But he will not let the most advanced knowledge of mankind in the religion believed by more than 70% of the population be in the hands of a family. The Hightower family has these things, so what awaits them will be a tragic fate. Get ready to go. Roar, 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 rumble. The The Dothraki army, which can't be seen at the end, is lined up under the castle, counting supplies and numbers, and preparing to set off. And Viserys is standing at the place where the Queen of Thorns, Lady Olenna Edwine, stood. The silver-haired young man wore an exquisite black velvet robe, a snow-white cape on his shoulders, and black leather gloves. The breeze blew gently, his silver gold hair fluttered. He looked down at the army that was about to leave, and looked at the distant scenery. He was not going to participate in this war in person. The news had spread that His Majesty the King would stay in Highgarden to recuperate, supervise the war remotely, and quietly wait for the results of the war. And the beautiful garden castle of Highgarden was indeed suitable for vacation and recuperation. Highgarden is located on a raised hill, where the mountains, waters, and people are beautiful. The Manda River flows slowly, and the garden is full of flowers, green grass, and various rare animals. Because of the warm climate and suitable soil for growth, the flowers in Highgarden will not wither all year round. The Tyrell family was originally the steward of the river-baking gardener family. Later, when the Targaryen family invaded, the last generation of river-baking Mengen Gardener IX and all his sons died of dragon breath. Harlan Tyrell, the steward of Highgarden, offered Highgarden. In return, Aegon gave the ruling power of the Reach and Highgarden to the Tyrell family. Therefore, the Tyrell family, who were born as stewards, were particularly handy in managing the castle, and it can be said that they were very professional. Now the Tyrell family, who were given Highgarden by Aegon, have been taken back by Viserys again, just like the Tully family was stripped of their titles last year. However, the end of the Tyrell family was even worse. From nothing to nothing, 300 years of rule and mountains of wealth seemed to be in vain, like a bubble, like a dream. Harlan Tyrell, the ancestor of the Tyrell family, once knelt in front of Aegon and swore eternal allegiance. But when Viserys led his troops to counterattack Westeros, the Tyrell family betrayed their oath and stood on the opposite side of him. Therefore, it was reasonable for Viserys to take back the Highgarden given by Aegon. His Majesty stayed in the beautiful Highgarden for recuperation and rest, but he still sent his Mount Balerion, the Black Death, to assist the Dothraki army in attacking Old Town. The original owner of Highgarden, the Tyrell family, had left here earlier yesterday with their families and moved to Starspot City in accordance with the order of His Majesty. But yesterday, before the Tyrell family was ready to leave Highgarden, Lady Olenna, the Queen of Thorns, inadvertently mentioned her little granddaughter Marguerite Tyrell. The girl has a natural beauty embryo, soft brown curly hair, pure and watery brown eyes like a doe, and the lines of her figure have begun to grow. She is smart and clever, and even has the title of Rose of Highgarden in the noble circle of the River Reach. I don't know how many nobles of the Seven Kingdoms have proposed to the Tyrell family for themselves or their heirs, but they were all rejected by Lady Olenna one by one, because the little Rose has a dream. A few days ago, Viserys first set foot in Highgarden. He had seen this girl when he met Lady Olenna, and she left some impression on him. Lady Olenna seemed to love her little granddaughter very much. Every time she met Viserys, she would bring Marguerite Tyrell with her. Lady Olenna mentioned that her little granddaughter Marguerite had always had a dream of becoming a queen. But the reality was a pity. Marguerite's age was not very suitable for either Viserys or Robert. Viserys was 8 or 9 years older than her, and the little Rose of Highgarden was too young for him. Moreover, a king in his prime could not die prematurely without an accident, and he had no son yet. The eldest daughter, Princess Diana, was 11 years younger than Marguerite Tyrell. Therefore, whether looking for Viserys or waiting for Viserys' son, Marguerite's age did not seem to be very suitable. This was a bit cruel for a girl who aspired to become a queen. Then Lady Olenna asked Viserys to send her granddaughter Marguerite Tyrell to the Red Keep as a maid of the Queen of Dawn, just like the eldest lady of Winterfell. The reason she gave was that King's Landing was the political center of the Seven Kingdoms, with many dignitaries, and she hoped that Marguerite would meet a good match in the future. However, Lady Olenna's proposal was rejected by Viserys. After thinking about it, his queen did not need so many maids. He certainly knew that this was a political tactic of Lady Olenna. Although the Tyrell family was not good at leading troops to fight, their methods in the court were more sharp. Lady Olenna still hoped that the Tyrell family could regain their strength one day, so she placed her hopes on Marguerite. Chapter 544. Enemy at the Gate. Who? The blood of the soldiers in the Reach dyed the land red, and the nauseating stench could be smelled dozens of miles away. Vultures had been hovering for half a month since the end of the war, and the area had completely become a no man's land. Now this group of terrifying grassland cavalry is heading towards Old Town, which naturally makes the people living in Old Town panic, as if the end of the world is coming. Old Town is located in the southwest corner of the Reach, where the Mead River flows into the estuary of Whispering Bay and Sunset Sea. It is also the southernmost end of the Rose Avenue connecting Highgarden and King's Landing. This is the most important port in Westeros, without a doubt, even more than King's Landing, and the population is not much less, but it is not as dense as King's Landing. Old Town is also the sea and land trade center of the Seven Kingdoms. Ships from all over the world gather here, and the routes are all over Westeros, the Summer Islands, the Free Trade City, and even Pentos and Andalus. However, the shadow of war now hangs over this great city, which naturally affects the local business development. The Sailor's Temple, the Seven Temples, the port, and even the Temple of the Foreign Gods, which used to be bustling, suddenly became much quieter. The merchant fleet took their goods and left Old Town, and the people of Old Town who had the conditions also took out their tickets and left here. As for those who did not leave, most of them had no money and could not afford the high ticket, or they thought that the matter was not big and it was difficult to leave their hometown, and there were also lunatics who wanted to find opportunities in the war. The people of Old Town were in panic, and Earl Leeton Hightower, the voice of Old Town, the master of the harbor, the Earl of the Towering Tower, the guardian of the school city, and the lighthouse of the south, was naturally more anxious. The Hightower family has always claimed to be the lighthouse leading human progress. Their family emblem is a staircase-shaped white tower with a smoky background and a beacon burning on the top. The family motto is "Light up the future." However, if it were not for Viserys' Sword of Change, the Hightower family always stood out and hung their heads high. They should not have participated in this war and even surrendered to Viserys long ago. But the power of the Sword of Change was so great that Lord Leeton Hightower, the Lord of the Towering Tower, hesitated. In addition, Mace Tyrell was his son-in-law, so he hesitated and sent troops to join the war. However, the subsequent battle wiped out the soldiers of the Hightower family, and only a few remnants escaped back, and the garrison of Old Town was seriously reduced. In order to prepare for the next battle, the Hightower family took out a large number of gold dragons, urgently recruited a large number of mercenaries and wandering knights, and captured many strong men to make up the numbers, but the combat effectiveness can be imagined. Even the people of Old Town could not trust their own army, believing that such a temporary patchwork army was unable to resist the attack of the barbarians, and even complained about why the Hightower family had not yet bowed to Viserys. But this was actually an injustice to the guardian of Old Town, Lord Leeton Hightower. Since he received the results of the Battle of Star Shuttle City, he immediately decided to surrender to the new conqueror without hesitation. However, he did not expect that the surrender letter he sent did not receive any response, as if it had sunk into the sea. Lord Leeton Hightower even thought that his raven was taken away by an eagle. So the old man of Old Town once again sent 2 letters of surrender, and even invited His Majesty to visit the Starry Sepulchre in Old Town to replicate the story of Aegon's coronation. But the latter 2 letters of surrender also fell on deaf ears, and no response was received. There was only news that the Dothraki army and the Dornish army, which had recuperated, were rushing to Old Town. This time, the Hightower family completely gave up their last hope and began to recruit troops to prepare for a decisive battle with the Targaryen army. In the 294th year of the Aegon calendar, the 2nd year of the new calendar, the Hightower family army, which hastily responded to the battle, fought against the Dothraki army in the Hive City. Lord Leeton Hightower's eldest son and heir, Sir Baelor Hightower, personally took charge and even invited Moreth, a doctor of war from the Citadel, to assist. The Doctor of War Studies was well versed in history and had a thorough knowledge of war. Although the army of Old Town was hastily recruited and received simple training, it still lined up in an orderly manner. However, it was defeated by the Dothraki army in one battle. When the Black Death Balerion appeared from the clouds, the commanders of the Old Town army, Baelor Hightower and Dr. Moreth, showed desperate expressions on their faces. The dragon's flames destroyed the formation of the Hightower family army and defeated the soldiers' will to resist. Coupled with the impact of the grassland cavalry, the army's morale collapsed in an instant, and they became lambs to be slaughtered. Sir Bela Hightower and Dr. Morath of the Citadel were burned to death by dragon breath on the spot. It is said that the river that can flow with fine wine and honey is now flowing with the blood of the Hightower family soldiers. The blood dyed the Mead River red. Before the news of the defeat came, the bodies of the soldiers were densely covered on the river surface and quickly came to Old Town along the river. The people and nobles of Old Town were even more panicked, and they all asked to leave Old Town by boat. However, Lord Leighton Hightower, who was known as the voice of Old Town, the Lord of the Harbour, the Lord of the Towering Tower, the Guardian of the Citadel, and the Lighthouse of the South, heard the tragic news and witnessed the Mead River stained with blood. He refused to leave, as if he had gone mad. He led his eldest daughter Moroy Hightower, nicknamed Madwoman, to the top of the Towering Tower to comprehend the ancient magic books, trying to find a way to defeat the Dothraki army and kill Viserys and his dragon with magic. However, before he found the right way, the Dothraki army defeated Old Town on the banks of the Mead River. Before the army could reach Old Town, the Dawn army got here first and laid siege to the city. Chapter 545 Attack on the Old Town. Archers! Archers! Hurry! Line up here. The Dornish army was approaching the city. The gates of Old Town were closed. The soldiers of the city garrison hurriedly climbed the city walls and prepared to defend against the Dornish attack. The walls of Old Town were not very tall, and the soldiers of the garrison were not elite. It had been breached many times in history, including Samwell Dane, King of Dorne, Corey Hall, the Iron King, and Giles I, the Gardener, the King of the Reach. After Giles I, the King of the Reach, breached Old Town, he sold 3/4 of the residents here as slaves, but in the end he still failed to conquer the towering tower of the Hightower family. Woo. Then, on the silent battlefield in the distance, the horns behind the Dornish army sounded melodiously. Hoo 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 hoo. The Dornish army's formation was solemn, marching in neat steps, and there was no end in sight. The oppressive feeling that came over them made people feel suffocated. The soldiers of Dawn wore sandy yellow uniforms and leather armor made of metal scales, with helmets wrapped in turbans. The cavalry rode on tall desert horses, holding scimitars and round shields with short spears on their backs, while the infantry of Dawn held spears and shields, and the archers carried quivers and double-arc longbows, with scimitars on their waists. Various flags of Dawn nobles fluttered, the largest of which was the flag of the Martell family with a sun-piercing golden spear, followed closely by the flag of the Dawn commander, the Ironwood family, the Dane family of Starfall, the Tullen family of Erebos, the Uller family of Hellgate, and even the Fowler family of Skypoint, which had always been estranged from the Ironwood family. All troops, listen to the order. Prepare to attack. Then, under the command of the commander, Earl Anders Ironwood, they launched an attack on Old Town. Clang. Dawn soldiers all drew their scimitars from their waists, raised their shields, and rushed towards Old Town. Kill. Boom boom boom. The improvised war weapons in the back roared, and huge rocks burning with flames flew into the sky, densely packed, dragging long black smoke, and then fell heavily. Some of the huge rocks burning with flames hit the city walls and made a loud noise, while others hit the top of the city. The soldiers of the Hightower family screamed, and a large number of them were killed and injured. A huge rock burning with flames flew over the top of Old Town and fell into the building in the back. Boom. Ordinary houses were not as strong as the city walls, and they were instantly collapsed by the huge rocks thrown by the catapult. But fortunately, the owner of this family had fled Old Town with his family before the war came, and was spared. The huge rocks were wrapped with kerosene, and in an instant, flames burst out from the ruins of the house, and flames and thick smoke began to rise. The city scenery of Old Town is very beautiful, with trickling streams and torrential rivers, as well as canals scattered around, and cobblestone streets of all sizes, forming a neat and refreshing city landscape. Although the population of Old Town is also large, it is not as dense as King's Landing, which is not as dense as King's Landing, the dunghill that has become the political center of Westeros due to its power. However, the arrival of the war broke the peace and harmony of Old Town, and the fire gradually began to burn, devouring the ruins of the houses. Put out the fire. Quick. Put out the fire. Sir Gunther Hightower, the third son of Earl Leighton Hightower, the guardian of Old Town, is now under the city wall. He nervously commanded the Hightower family soldiers to quickly put out the flames, to prevent the fire from spreading further and causing disastrous consequences. On the city wall, Sir Gunther Hightower's brother, Earl Leighton Hightower's second son, nicknamed Grey Iron, was leading the battle. Their elder brother, Bela Hightower the Fart, had died in the Mead River while leading the army. Naturally, the other brothers of the Hightower family had to take up the heavy responsibility. Archers. Garth Hightower, fully armed and wearing armor, stood on the wall of Old Town, drew his sword from his waist, looked at the Dornish army rushing towards him, and then shouted angrily, "Archers, ready, shoot." Bang, bang, bang. With the order of Garth Hightower, the second son of Earl Leighton, the soldiers of the Old Town garrison raised their bows and arrows high, and arrows fell from the sky. On the other side, the Dornish army was also fully prepared. "Raise your shields. Raise your shields." Sir Gullion Codgel, the eldest son of Sandston City, saw the defenders on the top of the city shooting arrows, drew his scimitar from his waist, and shouted loudly. The Dornish soldiers all raised their shields to block their heads. The overwhelming rain of arrows fell like raindrops, hitting the shields on the heads of the Dornish soldiers with a bang. But some arrows still penetrated the gaps in the shield formation, and the soldiers who were hit screamed and fell to the ground. Then, the Dornish soldiers, with dense arrows above their heads, raised their shields and carried ladders on their shoulders and finally arrived at the wall of Old Town. "Quick, set up the ladder. Set up the ladder." A knight from the Hellgate family was commanding the soldiers to climb the city, but he was caught off guard and shot in the chest by a stray arrow. He screamed and fell off his horse heavily. However, although the Old Town garrison fought desperately and fought back desperately, the ladders were successfully set up. Climb the wall. Climb the wall. Compared to the famous fortresses and cities in the Seven Kingdoms, the walls of Old Town were not very tall and solid. The Dornish soldiers put the ladders on the walls and began to climb the walls bravely. Because the commander of the Dornish army, Earl Anders Ironwood, promised that the soldiers who climbed the walls of Old Town first would be rewarded with 1,000 gold dragons. Kill. The Dornish warriors held up their round shields in one hand and grabbed the ladders in the other hand and then launched an attack on the walls of Old Town, shouting and killing. Bang, bang, bang. The soldiers of the Old Town garrison on the wall kept shooting arrows, hoping to stop the attack of the Dornish army, and worked together to push down the ladders, holding stones high and smashing them down. Many Dornish soldiers were hit by a stone when they climbed halfway, fell to the ground, and broke their legs and feet, and screamed. Attack. Shouts and screams came one after another. The Dornish army attacked Old Town fiercely. The two sides fought fiercely, and the battle was extremely tragic. It lasted for half a day. However, the soldiers of the Old Town garrison fought desperately, but they could not resist in the end. The Dornish army gathered the remnants of the defeated troops after the Battle of Star Shuttle City, and a wave of fresh blood joined in, regrouping to attack Old Town. The soldiers of Old Town had been defeated in the Battle of Star Shuttle City. Only the temporary mercenaries and wandering knights were left, and even the captured strong men were left. Hold your position. Fight to the death. Sir Garth Hightower, the second son of the Hightower family on the city wall, was now covered in dust and exhausted. He desperately commanded the soldiers to plug the holes back and forth, but he could not stop the increasingly broken situation. Soon, more and more Dornish soldiers poured onto the city wall. The gate of Old Town was opened. Chapter 546. The Fall of the Old Town. The opening of the city gate means that Old Town has become very precarious. But the Old Town garrison resisted very tenaciously at the city gate and repelled the attacks of the Dornish army several times. However, the defense was eventually broken, and a large number of Dornish soldiers poured into the city. The armies of both sides launched fierce street fighting in the streets and alleys. There were fighting figures in every cobblestone alley. The scenery of Old Town is beautiful, and the living atmosphere is quiet and peaceful. There are both big rivers and trickling streams, and many small canals dotted around. However, it used to be a place with small bridges and flowing water, a scene of a Jiangnan water town, but now it is all traces of war. Kill. In an alley, Several Dornish soldiers wrapped in white turbans faced several armored soldiers of the Hightower family. Both sides had already been bloodthirsty, and they roared and rushed up. Clang clang. Weapons collided violently, making a harsh sound. Sparks flew everywhere. The knights' long swords could not be used in the narrow alley, but the Dornishmen's scimitars seemed to be able to do it with ease. Bang! A Dornish soldier's scimitar slashed on the plate armor of the Hightower soldier, but it did not cut through, only leaving a scar. He was slightly stunned, and then the long sword pierced his chest. Puff! On the other side, a Hightower soldier's throat was cut by the scimitar. Blood gushed out like a fountain, and the body fell to the ground. Damn barbarian. The Hightower soldier holding the blood-stained longsword looked at the enemy. His eyes were a little red, revealing deep hatred. Dorne and the Reach were originally enemies. The war between the two sides lasted for thousands of years. Only after the Seven Kingdoms truly unified Dorne and surrendered to the Iron Throne did they fall into a brief peace. The hatred between the two sides has long been one of you and me. Then both sides roared and rushed over, facing each other with swords, and started a fierce fight. In the end, blood flew everywhere, and they hugged each other, and fell into a small river in the old town. The war started in the early morning, and it was dusk now. It lasted for most of the day. The Dorne army had frequent victories, while the Hightower family army was defeated. The two sides fought repeatedly in the old town, and the Dorne army even paid a more tragic price than the siege. Gunther Hightower, the third son of the Hightower family, was defeated and captured in the battle. He laid down his weapons and begged for surrender to the Dorne army, but was beheaded by the Dorne soldiers who were bloodthirsty. The death of Gunther Hightower angered more soldiers of the Hightower family. They fought back more bravely after knowing that they could not survive, even if they laid down their weapons. But now, both the Dorne army and the Hightower family soldiers have fallen into exhaustion, but neither side can retreat, otherwise all their previous efforts will be wasted. However, at this moment, the sun was setting, and it was dusk. A melodious dragon roar suddenly came from the distant sky, followed by a dull and low sound like thunder coming quickly from far away. Rumble, the earth trembled slightly, and the huge roar shook the two sides who were fighting, turned their heads and looked behind. Under the setting sun, a huge black shadow spread its wings, and flew to the end of the sky, level with the fiery red sunset. On the ground, a black line first appeared on the distant horizon, and then there was no end in sight. The overwhelming grassland cavalry rushed towards Old Town. The Dothraki and the mounts of the King of the Seven Kingdoms who defeated the main force of the Hightower family on the banks of the Mead River rushed to the battlefield. They carried the power of a great victory and overwhelmed the courage of all the Hightower family soldiers in Old Town to resist. Rumble, the sound of horse hooves roared and trembled. Roar, 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 roar. Countless Dothraki warriors raised their scimitars high in the sunset, reflecting the red light, howling, and then rushed into the city gate occupied by the Dornish army. Quick! Get out of the way! Get out of the way! The generals of the Dornish army saw this group of fierce and evil people rushing to the battlefield and their faces suddenly changed. Especially when the Dothraki charge, they will cover the eyes of their horses without any slowdown, and they have no eyes for any friendly forces. I don't know how many Dornish soldiers who blocked the Dothraki charge were knocked away and trampled into meat paste. Quick! 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 Everyone! Make way for the cavalry! The grassland cavalry attacked like a storm, and the Dornish army instantly retreated to the two sides to make way, and some who were unable to react in time were trampled into meat paste, but the Dornish generals dared not speak out. After all, it was not the first time they dealt with this group of barbarians. They had also seen the way they fought in Star Shuttle City. After the Dothraki poured into the old town, the tense situation changed drastically. Roar, roar, roar. The Hightower soldiers had never seen the Dothraki fighting before. Their horses rushed forward like tanks, and their scimitars were raised high and then dropped. Puff, puff, puff. The Hightower soldiers on both sides of the road who were trying to use street fighting to drag down the Dorne army had their throats cut, or were directly knocked away by their horses, and fell into the river. Ho! The dragon flew in the sky, casting a huge shadow on the ground, and let out a low roar. The Hightower soldiers below were still resisting stubbornly. They looked at the dragon stepping on the city wall in horror, and then drew their bows and arrows. Then a rain of arrows fell on the heavy scales of the Black Death, but they were bounced off, and fell to the ground like iron forging. Balerion stood on the wall, his scarlet pupils full of cruelty, as if he was angered by the harassment of the little guys below, and then he opened his huge mouth. A mouthful of dragon flame poured down, and the shrill screams came one after another. The dragon flame burned the stubborn Hightower family soldiers into ashes. The remaining soldiers were terrified, dropped their weapons, and turned to flee. Balerion then turned his head and looked at a conspicuous black giant building standing in the old town. Boom. Then the dragon's hind legs suddenly exerted force and flew towards the direction of the Starry Temple. On the other side, the Dothraki army that rushed into the old town destroyed the last hope of the Hightower family like a whirlwind. The war was over, and their soldiers were ravaged under the iron hoof. Oharat, the naked upper body of the Dothraki blood guard, drew the scimitar at his waist, and the shining tip of the knife pointed directly at the distant school city. Roar, roar, roar! A ghostly cheer broke out in the Dothraki formation, and then countless Dothraki warriors brandished scimitars and rushed towards the direction of the citadel. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 547, Collapse of the Temple. Ho, the dragon's silhouette hovered in the sky, and its roar spread far away. For some reason, Balerion suddenly gave up the ordinary soldiers targeting the Hightower family, and instead focused his attention on the very conspicuous black building standing in the old town. The Starry Sept is the largest sept in Old Town. For thousands of years before the Conquest War, it had always been the headquarters of the Church of the Seven Gods and the seat of the Archbishop. Later, 300 years ago, when Egan first landed in King's Landing, the Archbishop at that time locked himself in the Starry Sept to pray for 7 days and 7 nights, listening to the teachings of the gods, and only ate some bread and water during this period. Then when he came out of seclusion, the Archbishop announced to the public that the church would no longer resist Egan and his sisters, because he predicted that if Old Town would one day raise an army to resist the Dragon King of the Targaryen family, the dragon flames would burn the downtown, the citadel, the towering tower, and the Starry September. Back then, the Hightower family believed the prophecy of the High Septon and kept the army to open the door for Egan in exchange for peace. Now, 300 years have passed, and the masters of the tower have changed one after another. The current master of the tower, Lord Leighton Hightower, ignored the previous prophecy and chose to stand on the opposite side of Viserys. At dusk, the red clouds covered the sky. Balerion's figure hovered over the sky of Old Town and kept roaring, like a doomsday scene. Rumble, then the dragon swooped down and spewed dragon flames. The dazzling red fire column slammed into the dome of the Starry Cathedral, like a knife cutting a soft cream cake. Ho, the Black Death attacked the Starry Cathedral. The fragile dome was unable to resist and instantly shattered. Dust flew, and then collapsed. Run. Help. Save me. The monks and nuns inside the Starry Cathedral were running in all directions. The brown-robed monks who used to stay in the cathedral for meditation could not take care of their meditation. The silent sisters lost their silence and shouted in panic. Boom. Then the dragon landed on this magnificent building, and the prosperous cathedral was wailing under the surging dragon flames. It collapsed piece by piece, injuring and killing countless monks and nuns. How the surging dragon flames continued. Because of the continuous spitting, the temperature of the dragon flames was too high and even the color began to distort slightly. The flames melted the black marble used to build the Starry Cathedral. The flames broke the colorful glass and gushed in through the gorgeous arched windows. There were more people who were burned to death in it before they had time to run out, and they made miserable screams that made people shudder. Up in a tower of the Starry Cathedral, several monks could not bear the pain of being burned by the fire. Flames burned on their backs, and then they jumped down from a tall tower. They wanted to jump into the river, but they were caught off guard at the critical moment. They fell directly from the sky like a sandbag and hit the riverside heavily. Bang, they fell into a pool of rotten meat. Several monks could not bear the pain of being burned to death and jumped down from the tower and died. Then the tower of the Starry Cathedral gradually tilted and collapsed. Boom. The tower collapsed. The earth trembled slightly. It fell into the river next to it, stirred up huge waves, and overturned countless ships that wanted to flee the old town in a hurry. The sun set, and the night gradually enveloped. Rumble. The sky of the old town was completely illuminated by the fire. The dragon stretched its wings and kept spewing dragon flames around the starry cathedral, and this magnificent giant cathedral was constantly falling apart. I don't know how many monks and nuns who had escaped from the starry cathedral watched it wail in the flames, couldn't help crying, knelt down in the blood and fire, and kowtowed continuously, hoping that the 7 gods would bring down the wrath of thunder to destroy their enemies. However, they only saw the statues of the 7 gods melted, and then with a loud bang, the starry cathedral completely collapsed in the dragon flames. The huge roar spread far away, and the rolling dust and airwaves continued to spread to the distance. The starry cathedral collapsed completely, and the faith of these monks and nuns collapsed. Some people kowtowed and bled, some people jumped into the river with desperate roars, and some monks took off their brown robes and threw them away, and then quietly slipped away. In the end of the world, all kinds of things happened frequently. Viserys is crazy. Viserys is crazy. What does this tyrant want to do? The citadel is located on the banks of the Mead River. It is composed of many islands. The towers and domes are connected by stone arch bridges. The scale of the citadel is huge, and it is the largest building complex in the old town. At this moment, the citadel is in chaos. The maesters and assistant maesters are running around like headless flies, and countless refugees are pouring into it. The Grand Steward of the citadel, Drive Theobald, was shocked and angry. He was walking back and forth anxiously in the steward's pavilion of the citadel. He did not expect that the situation outside was so bad. Viserys' black dragon actually attacked the starry September. What does this mean? Just thinking about it makes me feel chilled. Viserys wants to change the world. He is a real destroyer of order. This tyrant. He is crazy. The Grand Steward of the Citadel gritted his teeth and felt that his teeth were itchy. The Citadel's chief steward is replaced every year. This year, Drive Theobald won the lottery and became the chief steward of the Citadel, but he never expected that this would be a hot potato. In fact, since the Hightower family decided to intervene in the civil war in the 7 kingdoms, the Citadel has been prepared for war. Because the Citadel is full of bachelors who love to study data and theory, they have deduced the results after the outbreak of the civil war and calculated various possibilities. The Targaryen army won 70%. Only 10% of the results were a stalemate, and 20% were that the Noble Coalition would win. Therefore, the Citadel had already prepared for it, but it didn't take it too seriously. After all, no one would attack the Citadel in various wars throughout history. Until not long ago, the dark cloud of war finally enveloped the head of Old Town. Drive Theobald, the chief steward of the Citadel, symbolically dismissed a group of bachelors, and some of the remaining ones had not had time to leave, and more expressed their willingness to live and die with the Citadel. But all this happened too quickly, so fast that the Citadel was caught off guard. The defense of Old Town began in the morning, and fell by dusk, not even lasting a day. When the Dothraki army and dragons arrived, the direction of the war was even more terrifying. Chapter 548, Towering Tower. Viserys wants to destroy the old order and establish a completely unified new country. There will be no more 7 kingdoms, no more civil wars, no more ill nobles, only one king. A white-haired doctor in the Citadel's main chamber said worriedly. So he still had the patience to rest in King's Landing for half a year after he had commanded an army that could easily destroy the 7 kingdoms. The Dragon King of Targaryen is not being merciful to his enemies, but ensuring the thunderous force. All his enemies will be wiped out in this war, leaving no room for hesitation or turning back. Another doctor in the main chamber said. After the end of the First Conquest War, Viserys injured in King's Landing for half a year. According to the deductions of the maesters and doctors of the Citadel, the army controlled by the Targaryen family can actually continue to wage wars after occupying King's Landing, devouring the unrecovered Stormlands, the Reach, the Westerlands, and the Vale. However, Viserys did not do so, which confused the maesters for a while, and even thought that Viserys was really at ease to get married and have children in King's Landing. But now it seems that this is actually a sleight of hand. Viserys is accumulating strength for the second war of conquest and concealing his ambitions. Just like a punch, if you want to exert the greatest force, you need to pull your fist back first. He needs to fight to the end instead of dragging his feet, and be patient and determined without revealing any intention to attack the church and the citadel. Otherwise, he will be under great pressure and even forced to give up attacking the church and the citadel. This is the secular backlash against him. This is the attempt of the Targaryen Dragon King. Destroy the old order of the world, and anything that stands in his way will be ruthlessly destroyed. The church and the citadel are exactly on the opposite side of his destruction of the old order, a doctor said desperately. He wants to destroy the citadel, burn all the books in the world and bury all the Maesters alive to achieve his goal of building a new world. He didn't show up in Old Town and used barbarians to attack the city and destroy the Starry Sepulchre with thunder and lightning, which was the first blow to the church. Then he can put the blame on the barbarians and get himself clean. In the council chamber, the Maesters and Maesters talked in despair. They were all smart people and seemed to have guessed Viserys' thoughts. At this moment, a noisy sound came from outside. Roar, roar, roar. Countless Dothraki cavalry have poured into the citadel. In the center of Old Town, on the towering tower that soars into the sky, its top burns with a flame that will never go out, dispelling the darkness after sunset and becoming the last hope for all the people and soldiers of Old Town who are deeply trapped in pain. And the masters of the towering tower, the white-haired old men of Old Town, stay at the top of the towering tower, a place that ordinary people can never set foot in. The voice of Old Town, the lord of the harbor, the lord of the towering tower, the guardian of the citadel, the lighthouse of the south. Lord Leighton Hightower's titles are so long that they make him feel ashamed. The Targaryen army marched straight to Old Town. The old man of Old Town asked for surrender 3 times, but received no response. He angrily asked his eldest son to lead the troops to repel the enemy's attack, but he saw the blood-stained Mead River and the death of his eldest son, Baelor Hightower. From the Hightower family to ordinary people, everyone in Old Town was in panic. Lord Leighton Hightower's 10th child, and also his youngest son, Sir Humphrey Hightower, advocated abandoning Old Town and moving the whole family to Lies to join his sister, Lyness Hightower. Lyness Hightower was Lord Leighton's 8th child and his youngest girl. She was very beautiful, with long golden hair, milky white skin, and very soft hands. She first married Ser Jorah Mormont of Bear Island. Later, during the Great Migration of humans after the fall of the North, Lyness felt that it was impossible for humans to defeat the White Walkers, so she left the team and boarded a merchant ship in White Harbor to Lies, and never returned. After she arrived in Lies, she was intoxicated by the extravagance here and quickly accepted the pursuit of a Lies trade governor named Trigomaran, climbed onto his soft feather bed, and cuckolded her husband Ser Jorah Mormont. Now Sir Humphrey Hightower's sister has become the most beloved concubine of Governor Lies. He advocates that the whole family go to Lyness, and Governor Lies should give the Hightower family a place to stay. However, Sir Humphrey's proposal was severely rebuked by his father, Earl Leighton, who seemed to be extremely dissatisfied with his youngest daughter Lyness. At first, he opposed this marriage and did not want his daughter to marry far away in the north, but Lyness threatened her father with some handles and then willfully married Ser Jorah Mormont. Then she left Jorah when he needed her most and went to Lies to become someone else's mistress. Lord Leighton believed that such a daughter had ruined the honor of the Hightower family. He told his remaining 9 children and his 4th wife that he would not force anyone to leave, but they would live and die with the tower. Then the old man of Old Town took Mora Hightower to the top of the tower, claiming that they would study the magic codex together and find a way to defeat the Targaryen army, and never came down again. Although Mora was very beautiful when she was young, she became a middle-aged woman after all, and her figure and lines were inevitably distorted. Mora Hightower never married in her life and stayed with her father, and Lord Hightower had not stepped out of the tower for decades. Her mental state was sometimes good and sometimes bad, as if she had been stimulated by something, and she would say some nonsense, so she was called a mad woman. Mora looked at the war-torn Old Town below. The soldiers of the Hightower family fought desperately. The flames were burning everywhere in the city, and the thick smoke was billowing into the sky. Then a woman in her 30s, who was about to turn 40, was as excited as a child. So beautiful. Father, is this the fireworks you prepared for me? Morula turned her head and looked at her father excitedly. The fat old man in Old Town with grey hair had rough skin covered with age spots. The fat on his chest was shaking when he walked, and his chest was covered with hair. Lord Leighton Hightower put on his coat, but did not button it up, exposing his breasts. Then he grabbed a long sword, which was a Valyrian steel sword heirloomed from the Hightower family, and came to the window and looked down. Don't worry, the towering tower has never fallen. It won't fall today, Lord Leighton Hightower said confidently. However, at this moment, the dragon that destroyed the Starry Temple seemed to be eyeing this place. Ho! The roar of the dragon shook the sky, and Valyrian flew towards the towering tower. Chapter 549 Tax Collector. The night was shrouded in the sky lit by fire. The dragon soared in the sky and circled around the towering tower, spewing dragon flames and burning. The towering tower, more than 800 feet high, reached the sky, and the dragon's figure seemed a little small in front of it. However, the towering tower stood firm as Earl Leighton Hightower said. Even the dragon's flame could not burn its bricks and stones, but the people in the towering tower would not be so happy. They would be roasted in it like roast duck in a hanging oven. This level of punishment was unbearable for ordinary people, and even more uncomfortable than being burned to death. Their skin would lose moisture first, and become dry and crispy, followed by flesh and blood and internal organs. The fat was roasted out and sizzled, exuding an attractive fragrance. Perhaps it was their best choice to end their lives as soon as possible. The war was over. Lord Leighton Hightower and his eldest daughter, Madwoman Moroya Hightower, were roasted alive on the top of the towering tower. When their charred bodies were found later, the two seemed to still be hugging each other tightly. As for the other members of the Hightower family, some died and some fled. Some fled to the Shield Islands by boat, and some went directly to another continent. Garth Greyiron Hightower, who commanded the army, was besieged by the Dornish army on the battlefield. In the end, several spears pierced his heart, and he died in battle. The Hightower family army, which lost its commander, completely lost the courage to resist. Run. Run. Help. They threw away their weapons and fled in all directions. Some hid in the houses, and some took off their armor and jumped into the cold river, trying to swim out of Old Town by water. Now Old Town, the greatest city in Westeros, has become a living hell, with the Dornish army and Dothraki rampaging in the city. This is the trauma that war brings to mankind, but mankind cannot avoid it. Viserys, who was supposed to be recuperating in Highgarden, actually appeared on a hillside outside Old Town on a white horse. He took advantage of the thick night to overlook the city with flames in the distance. There were several loyal Dothraki roaring warriors around the silver-haired young man. They were wearing animal skin armor, horsehair leggings, holding scimitars and torches, and riding war horses, looking around vigilantly. It seems that Viserys came lightly and low-key. Maybe one day in the future people will understand each other, restrain each other, and avoid the outbreak of war. But not now. For this era, unification is the best way to end the civil war. Viserys looked at the flames of Old Town, then took a deep breath and said, "The war in the Reach is over." Beside him, the new Earl of Starspot City, Willis Tyrrell, had a complicated expression. If Highgarden and Old Town had made the same choice, would they have ended up like this? But Lord Leighton Hightower of Old Town was his grandfather, and his mother, Ellery Hightower, was the second daughter of Lord Leighton. It was hard for Willis not to feel sad for the death of the rabbit and the fox, while he was feeling fortunate. Your Majesty is right, but this is also one of the stubborn diseases that Westeros has been unable to cure before. Family, power, such concepts are deeply rooted. People don't know how to unite, let alone understand each other. The night was shrouded, and the fire in the distance illuminated his cheeks. Willis pulled the reins to make the restless warhorse under his crotch more honest. Although Viserys rejected Lady Olenna's request to send Little Rose to the harem, and drove them out of Highgarden and moved to Star Shuttle City, he did not kill the Tyrrell family with one stick. Willis Tyrrell expressed his desire to come to King's Landing and do any kind of work. And Viserys recognized Willis's ability, so he appointed him as a tax officer under the Chancellor of the Exchequer. who would be responsible for taxation in a certain area for the royal family in the future. This job is not very powerful, but it is indeed a lucrative job. Viserys put Willis Tyrrell in such a position to test his ability. The new Earl of Starspa City got the opportunity to do this job, and agreed without any hesitation. Even if the tax collector may not be very friendly to a cripple like him after a long journey, Willis did not care, but seized the opportunity firmly. Therefore, when Viserys set out from Highgarden to Old Town, he brought Willis Tyrrell with him. Old Town was the last major castle and city in the south of the kingdom that was still resisting the Iron Throne. When the army of the Iron Throne conquered Old Town, the south of the kingdom was almost completely recovered. Next, when the war was over, Willis Tyrrell would follow Viserys and the army north to return to King's Landing to take up his post, waiting for the news that the king's army would settle in the north and the country would be unified. Your Majesty, do you want to use the Dothraki's butcher knife to eliminate the citadel and the church in one battle? Looking at the old town in the distance, which was wailing under the iron hoofs, the starry cathedral collapsed under the dragon flames, and the dragons kept spewing dragon flames around the towering tower. Willis Tyrrell, who was standing on the hill outside the city, was silent for a moment, but couldn't help but speak. For your Majesty's great ideals, the church and the citadel have indeed become obstacles. Your idea of using the Dothraki to eradicate them under the pretext of recuperation is indeed a stroke of genius, but Willis Tyrrell was hesitant to speak. He was educated in the citadel since he was a child, and it was indeed a bit unbearable to see Old Town fall into crisis. Viserys heard Willis' voice, turned his head, and looked at him, and then spoke. But what? Burning down the starry cathedral will cause the believers of the seven gods to rebound? And knowledge and books are innocent, right? You. Willis was slightly stunned. He didn't expect Viserys to know all this. He thought Viserys was a cold-blooded man who would do anything to achieve his goal, but he didn't expect him to be sober, and not at all dazzled by victory. If you knew from the age of 8 that a king wanted to kill you, and you were helpless, you would know that you should think twice before doing anything. Viserys said calmly. The world I want is not built on people who are loyal to the current order. If the believers jump out now, we can get rid of them all at once. Otherwise it will be inconvenient to start a war after the world is peaceful. As for the citadel, as the highest institution of knowledge in Westeros, they should not be concentrated together, and they should not be far away from the capital of the kingdom. I will split it up and scatter it all over the world. From Winterfell to Dawn, from Lannisport to Pentos. Chapter 550 Return to the capital. The next morning, the sun dispelled the haze of the night. However, the old town was still filled with black smoke, and there were still sporadic sounds of fighting in a few places, but most places were already filled with the flags of the Dornish army. No. Spare my life. Please. On both sides of the street, a soldier from the Hightower family was roughly pulled out of a house by the Dornish people. He was wearing tattered armor and his weapons had been thrown away long ago. He thought he could escape by hiding here, but he didn't expect to be found. The Hightower family soldier's face was full of panic, with snot and tears. He knelt on the ground and begged for mercy, but the Dornish soldier with a turban ruthlessly cut his throat with a dagger, and his body fell to the ground. Puff. On the other side, a soldier from the Ironwood family also executed a seriously injured and dying enemy with a spear. Now, the sky gradually brightens, and the streets of Old Town are full of holes after the war. Looking back, it is devastated, broken houses, scattered bricks and rubble, corpses lying in all directions, and blood dyed the rivers in Old Town red. The war is over. The Dornish army re-engraved the achievements of Samwell Dane, the king of the rushing river, and conquered Old Town. The Dornish people have captured this place again after many years, and many Dornish nobles can even regard it as a glory worth bragging about for a lifetime. They rode on tall horses, fully dressed in military uniforms, and walked on the streets of Old Town in a show of force, mocking the enemies of generations, and attracted the hateful eyes of countless Old Town residents hiding in their homes. This night is definitely the most unforgettable night for the people of Old Town and the soldiers of the Hightower family. The Starry Temple collapsed, and the Dothraki, who they had never heard of before, and even lived only in legends, invaded the school city. The scholars of the Citadel may have heard of the names of these prairie knights, But reading thousands of books is not the same as traveling thousands of miles. They never thought that one day these demons living on another continent would cross the poisonous water they called and come to their front. However, what surprised them was that after the Dothraki invaded the citadel, they did not raise their butcher knives and kill everyone here, but instead seemed very gentle. Except for a few stubborn people, who were beheaded without hesitation. The Dothraki cavalry did not harm anyone who knelt down and surrendered, as if they had received certain orders long ago. They arrested the remaining assistant maesters, and doctors who knelt down, and detained them in the dormitory in the citadel, which was temporarily converted into a cell to wait for the Cal's decision. The books in the citadel were not burned, but were also protected. A few days later, the news of the end of the war spread back to Highgarden like wings, and at the same time, the victory report of the kingdom's navy was also brought along. In the Second Conquest War, there were 3 armies of the Targaryen family on the ground, and on the surface, the old general of the Admiralty, Lord Geoffrey Bracken, personally led the Royal Navy to attack Gulltown in the Vale. The navy of the Righteous Alliance went out to fight, but suffered a devastating blow, and all were sunk in Crab Bay. Then the Royal Navy, led by the old general, began to attack this important town in the Vale. The two sides fought fiercely for more than a month, and the main force of the Righteous Alliance was still in the Eyrie, because they were arguing about taking advantage of Viserys' departure to attack King's Landing. In the end, Gulltown was conquered by the Royal Army, and the Eyrie reacted and decided to put down their weapons and jointly resist the enemy. The organizer of the Righteous Alliance, Lord Gian Royce of Runestone City, personally led the army to recapture Gulltown, and the Bloody Gate Knight Blackfish Brynden Tully served as the deputy commander. Lord Gian Royce was worried about leaving the young master and Lysa Tully in the Eyrie surrounded by wolves, and was even more afraid that power would fall into someone else's hands after he left, so he decided to take away Robert Arryn and Lysa Tully, the precious mother and son. As the deputy commander, Brynden Tully, the Blackfish, also held great power. He controlled a Stormland army of thousands of people borrowed from Renly. He heard his niece's exaggerated account of the series of events that had happened in the Eyrie before. Brynden Tully was extremely angry and even wanted to draw his sword and kill people immediately. But in the end, he restrained himself for the sake of the overall situation. But he would never let Lysa be alone with these hungry wolves. In order to protect his niece, he decided to take Lysa with him. And Petty Baelish, the Little Finger, also followed the army to go to war. Now the army of the valley is marching to Gulltown. The news of Old Town and the Vale reached Highgarden, and the king, who was nominally recuperating in Highgarden, was indeed here at the moment. He had just returned not long ago, but the news from the Westerlands that he had been waiting for had not yet arrived. Then the control of Old Town was transferred to the Dornish army, and the Dothraki army began to return to the court, and they brought with them the people of the citadel and all the books that could be moved. Because some ancient books have been around for too long, the paper has long been extremely fragile, and it is even difficult to open and move. If they go through this migration, I'm afraid that these ancient books will be gone. Therefore, the doctors of the citadel begged Cargo to leave these books, and Cargo finally agreed. However, even so, many ancient books were left in the citadel, and the books that needed to be moved in the citadel were still extremely shocking. The Dothraki requisitioned a large number of carriages from Old Town, and freed up hundreds of thousands of war horses to transport these books to Highgarden. The Dothraki army returned to Highgarden. Because of the series of atrocities committed by these barbarians in Old Town, Viserys punished Cargo, the commander of the Dothraki army. He whipped Cargo 3 times with a whip, while sitting on horseback. Cargo knelt on one knee beside Viserys' horse with his upper body naked, and let their Khal whip him 3 times without saying a word, as if it was agreed in advance. Then Viserys rewarded the Dothraki for their military exploits, and appointed Cargo as the war minister of the new dynasty. He more than doubled the territory of the Dothraki across the Narrow Sea, and promised to lead them back to V's Dothraki in the future and rule all the tribes. Roar. After receiving Viserys' promise, all the Dothraki raised their scimitars and cheered, as if the whipping of Cargo just now had never happened. After rewarding the Dothraki, Viserys met with the masters and maesters of the citadel who had been escorted to Highgarden by them. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like, Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.